What if the woman bleeding on your doorstep turned out to be worth billions tonight? We dive deep into Jack Miller's impossible choice, a struggling mechanic whose life exploded when he discovered two strangers hiding outside his garage weren't just running from an abusive husband, but from one of America's most powerful oil dynasties. Before we begin this incredible journey, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. The thunder rolled across Houston like God himself was rearranging the furniture upstairs, and Jack Miller pulled his worn baseball cap lower over his eyes as he fumbled with the lock on Miller's auto repair. The rain came down in sheets so thick he could barely see his own pickup truck parked 20 feet away. At 34, Jack had seen plenty of Texas storms, but this one felt different, angrier somehow, like nature had a personal grudge against the world tonight. Son of a... Jack muttered as his keys slipped from his rain-slicked fingers, clattering onto the cracked asphalt. He'd been working on Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick until nearly midnight, trying to squeeze every last dollar out of a transmission that should have been put out of its misery years ago. The shop wasn't exactly thriving, but it kept food on the table and the lights on, which was more than a lot of folks in this neighborhood could say. As he bent to retrieve his keys, a flash of lightning illuminated something that made his heart skip a beat. There, huddled against the side wall of his garage like wounded animals seeking shelter, were two figures. A woman and what looked like a child pressed together in the narrow space between his building and the chain-link fence that separated his lot from the abandoned gas station next door. Jack straightened slowly, his mechanic's instincts warring with his better judgment. In this part of Houston, you minded your own business. You didn't go looking for trouble because trouble had a way of finding you all on its own. But something about the way they were holding each other, the desperate stillness of their pose, made him take a step closer. "Hey," he called out over the storm, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. "You folks okay over there?" The woman's head snapped up, and even in the dim light from the street lamp, Jack could see the fear that flashed across her face. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. But she didn't run. Instead, she seemed to gather herself, pulling the child, a boy Jack realized, closer to her side. "Please," she called back, her voice cultured and clear, despite the tremor of exhaustion that ran through it. "We're not looking for trouble. We just need somewhere to wait out the storm." Jack took another step closer, and the next flash of lightning revealed details that made his breath catch in his throat. The woman was probably in her early 30s, with dark hair that might have been elegant once but now hung in damp tangles around her face. She was wearing what looked like expensive clothes, a cream-colored blouse and dark slacks that probably cost more than Jack made in a week, but they were torn and dirty. And there on her left cheek was the unmistakable purple shadow of a fresh bruise. The boy beside her couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, with the same dark hair and the kind of pale, delicate features that spoke of good genetics and better nutrition. But his clothes were rumpled, and he was shaking, whether from cold or fear, Jack couldn't tell. "Jesus," Jack breathed. And before his common sense could kick in, he was jogging toward them, his work boots splashing through puddles that had already formed in the uneven pavement. "Ma'am, you can't stay out here in this weather. Come on, let's get you inside." The woman's eyes went wide with something that might have been relief or might have been fresh terror. "You don't understand," she said quickly, her hand moving protectively to the boy's shoulder. "We can't. We shouldn't impose. If someone sees us—" "Lady, I don't know what you're running from, and right now I don't care," Jack said, fishing his keys out of his pocket again. "But nobody deserves to drown in a parking lot, especially not a kid. Come on." He turned his back on them, deliberately unlocking the side door to his shop and pushing it open. Warm air and the familiar smell of motor oil and coffee rushed out to greet them. Jack flicked on the lights, illuminating the cramped but organized space where he'd spent the better part of his adult life. Tool chests lined the walls, and the skeleton of Mrs. Henderson's Buick sat in the center bay like a patient waiting for surgery. For a moment he thought they might not follow him, but then he heard the soft splash of footsteps, and when he turned around, the woman and boy were standing just inside the doorway, dripping puddles onto his concrete floor, and looking around like they'd just entered an alien spaceship. "There's a coffee pot in the back," Jack said, pointing toward the small office area he'd built into one corner of the shop. "Probably tastes like motor oil, but it's hot. And I think there's some crackers in the desk drawer." The woman stared at him for a long moment, and Jack found himself studying her face more carefully. Even bruised and exhausted, she was striking in a way that made him think of movie stars, or the kind of wealthy women he sometimes saw in the society pages of the newspaper. Her bone structure was too perfect, her posture too refined, even hunched with fear as she was now. "Thank you," she said finally, and her voice carried the kind of precise diction that came from expensive schools and careful upbringing. "I'm Elena. This is Thomas." "Jack Miller," he replied, then gestured around the shop. "Welcome to my palace." That earned him a small smile from the boy. "Thomas." And Jack felt something tight in his chest ease slightly. Kids bounced back fast usually. Give them someplace safe and warm, and they started to remember how to be children again. "Mr. Miller," Elena said carefully, "I need you to know that we can't stay long, and if anyone comes looking for us—" "Then I haven't seen you," Jack finished. He'd played this game before with other folks who'd found their way to his door over the years. This neighborhood had a way of attracting people who needed to disappear for a while. But right now, let's focus on getting you warmed up. "Thomas, you like hot chocolate?" The boy nodded eagerly, and Jack rummaged around in his office until he found an ancient package of cocoa mix. As he worked heating water in the electric kettle he used for his own coffee, he was acutely aware of Elena watching his every move. She'd positioned herself near the door, he noticed, ready to run if she needed to. "So," Jack said conversationally as he stirred cocoa powder into a chipped mug. "You folks from around here?" Elena hesitated. "No, we were passing through." It was clearly a lie, but Jack didn't call her on it. Instead, he handed the mug to Thomas, who accepted it with both hands, and a whispered "thank you" that sounded almost formal. The kid had manners that had been drilled into him from birth, Jack realized. The kind of old-school politeness that wealthy families still insisted on. "Storm's supposed to blow through by morning," Jack offered, settling into the battered office chair behind his desk. "You're welcome to stay until then. I've got some blankets in the supply closet, and the couch in here pulls out into a bed." "Sort of." Elena's composure cracked slightly, and for a moment Jack saw something raw and desperate flash across her face. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help us? You don't know anything about us." Jack considered the question seriously. Why was he helping them? He had his own problems, his own struggles. The shop was barely breaking. Even his sister Maria was constantly on his case about taking better care of himself, and the last thing he needed was to get mixed up in whatever trouble these two were running from. But then he looked at Thomas, small hands wrapped around the warm mug. Brown eyes still too wide with fear, and he remembered being 9 years old himself. Remembered what it felt like to be scared and have nowhere to go. "I guess because somebody helped me once when I needed it," Jack said finally. "Seemed like the right thing to pass it on." Elena stared at him for a long moment, and Jack had the uncomfortable feeling that she was taking his measure in some way that went far beyond the surface. Like she was trying to decide whether he was really the kind of man he appeared to be, or if this was all some elaborate trap. My father used to say that you could judge a man's character by how he treated people who couldn't do anything for him, she said quietly. Sounds like a smart guy. He was. Elena's voice carried a note of old grief. He died 5 years ago. An awkward silence settled over the small office, broken only by the sound of rain hammering against the windows and Thomas slurping his hot chocolate. Jack found himself studying Elena's hands as she wrapped them around the coffee mug he'd given her. Her wedding ring was gone, he noticed, but there was a pale band of skin around her finger that suggested she'd been wearing one recently, and her nails, though currently chipped and dirty, were manicured in a way that spoke of regular salon visits. Elena, Jack said carefully, I don't want to pry, but do you need me to call someone? The police or… No. The word came out sharp and panicked, and Thomas looked up from his cocoa with startled eyes. Elena forced herself to calm down, but Jack could see the effort it took. No police, please. You don't understand the situation. Then help me understand. Elena set down her coffee mug and wrapped her arms around herself like she was trying to hold something inside from spilling out. It's complicated. Most things worth doing are. She looked at him again with that searching expression, and Jack had the feeling that his answer would determine whether she trusted him with the truth or fed him another lie. Whatever was going on here, it was bigger than a simple domestic dispute. The expensive clothes, the perfect manners, the way Elena carried herself. Despite her obvious fear, it all added up to money. Serious money. And in Jack's experience, serious money usually meant serious trouble. My husband, Elena said, finally, the words coming out like she was pulling them from somewhere deep and painful. He's not a good man, and he has powerful friends. If they find us… She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Jack had seen enough bruises in his life to know the story they told, and he'd lived in Houston long enough to know that power and money could make inconvenient people disappear. How long has this been going on? He asked gently. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. Years. But I kept thinking. I kept hoping things would get better. That he would change. For Thomas's sake, if nothing else. Thomas had gone very still, his small hands clutched around the mug like it was an anchor. Jack's heart ached for the kid. No child should have to carry the weight of adult problems, shouldn't have to learn that the people who were supposed to protect you could be the very ones you needed protection from. What changed? Jack asked. What made you run now? Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her cheek, fingertips brushing the edge of the bruise that painted her pale skin in shades of purple and yellow. He hit Thomas, she said quietly. For the first time, he hit my son, and I realized that if I didn't get us out of there… She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Jack felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same anger that had gotten him into trouble more than once over the years. There were few things in this world that made him genuinely furious, but men who hurt children topped the list. Good for you, he said simply. Elena blinked at him in surprise. What? Good for you, Jack repeated. For protecting your boy. Takes guts to walk away from everything you know. Elena's eyes filled with tears, and Jack had the sense that it had been a long time since anyone had told her she'd done something right. I don't know what I'm doing, she admitted. I don't know where we're going to go or how we're going to live. I just knew we had to get out. One step at a time, Jack said. That's how anybody gets anywhere worth going. Thomas had been listening to this exchange with the peculiar intensity that children brought to adult conversations they weren't supposed to understand. Now he spoke up for the first time since they'd come inside. Mama, he said, his voice small but clear. Are we going to live here now? Elena's face crumpled slightly, and Jack could see her struggling to find words that would reassure her son without lying to him. It was an impossible balance trying to be honest with a child about danger without terrifying them. Just for tonight, sweetheart, she said finally. Mr. Miller is being very kind to let us stay until the storm passes. Thomas nodded solemnly, like this made perfect sense to him. Kids were adaptable that way, Jack thought. They could roll with almost anything as long as the adults in their lives projected confidence, even if that confidence was largely an act. Can I see the cars? Thomas asked, looking toward the main bay where Mrs. Henderson's Buick waited for its morning surgery. Jack glanced at Elena, who nodded reluctantly. Sure, kid. Just don't touch anything sharp, okay? Thomas scrambled down from his chair, with an enthusiasm that was purely childlike, all his earlier fear temporarily forgotten in the face of new surroundings to explore. Jack followed him out into the main shop, Elena trailing behind, with obvious reluctance to let her son out of her sight. This one's sick, Thomas announced, peering up at the Buick's exposed engine with the confident diagnosis of someone who'd clearly spent time around cars before. Very sick, Jack agreed. What gave it away? The transmission fluid is the wrong color, Thomas said matter-of-factly. And I can smell burned clutch material. Jack raised an eyebrow. The kid was right on both counts, which was impressive for someone who couldn't have been more than 9 years old. You know cars? Thomas nodded. Grandfather taught me. He said every carter should understand how things work. Elena went very still behind them, and Jack caught the sharp intake of her breath. Carter. The name rang a bell somewhere in the back of his mind, but he couldn't quite place it. Thomas, Elena said carefully, remember what we talked about not using certain names. The boy's face fell as he realized his mistake. Sorry, Mama. I forgot. It's okay, sweetheart. Just remember for next time. But Jack was already running the name through his mental database of Houston families, and when it clicked, he felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Carter. As in Carter Oil, one of the biggest petroleum companies in Texas. As in the Carter family, whose patriarch had died in a plane crash 5 years ago, leaving behind a business empire worth billions and a daughter who'd married into another oil family. Elena Carter. Elena Carter Blackwood, if he remembered the society page coverage correctly. Jack looked at the woman standing in his garage, her expensive clothes torn and dirty, her face bruised, her son clutching a chipped mug of discount hot chocolate, and felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He wasn't just harboring a battered wife and her child. He was hiding the daughter-in-law of Harrison Blackwood, one of the most powerful men in Texas. Holy shit, he breathed, then quickly looked at Thomas. Sorry, kid. Didn't mean to say that. Elena had gone pale, realizing that Jack had connected the dots. You know, she said. It wasn't a question. Elena Carter Blackwood, Jack said quietly. Your husband is Robert Blackwood. Your father-in-law is Harrison Blackwood, who owns about half the oil infrastructure between here and Oklahoma. Elena's shoulders sagged, and for a moment she looked every one of her years, and then some. Yes. And you're running from them, from all of them. Yes. Jack ran a hand through his damp hair, trying to process what this meant. The Blackwoods weren't just wealthy, they were connected. They had politicians in their pockets, judges on their payroll, and enough lawyers to populate a small city. If they wanted Elena and Thomas back, they had the resources to make it happen. And here Jack was a small-time mechanic with a struggling auto shop, and exactly 0 political connections standing between them and what they wanted. Jesus Christ, he muttered. then louder. "Thomas, why don't you go back to the office and finish your hot chocolate? I need to talk to your mom for a minute." The boy looked between them with the kind of awareness that came from living in a house where adult conversations often turned dangerous. But he nodded and trudged back toward the office, leaving Jack and Elena alone in the main bay. "You need to leave," Jack said as soon as Thomas was out of earshot. "Right now. I'm sorry, but I can't. I can't get involved in this. You know what kind of people your husband's family are, what they're capable of." Elena nodded slowly, like she'd been expecting this reaction. "I understand. I'm sorry for putting you in this position. We'll go." But even as she said it, Jack could see the exhaustion and defeat in her posture. She was running on empty, had probably been running on empty for days. And Thomas was just a kid, for God's sake. Where were they going to go in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm that was still raging outside? "Shit," Jack said again this time, not bothering to apologize for his language. "Elena, where exactly were you planning to go? Do you have family somewhere? Friends who could help?" Elena's laugh was bitter. "The Blackwoods made sure I didn't keep many friends. And my family," she shrugged. "When I married Robert, I was effectively disowned for choosing love over business alliances. I haven't spoken to my uncle in 5 years. Uncle, my father's brother. He took over Carter Oil after Daddy died. But he and Robert have been business partners for years. Even if I could reach him, I'm not sure he'd help me." Jack felt the walls closing in around them. Elena had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and her husband's family had the kind of resources that could track them anywhere they ran. The smart thing, the safe thing would be to push them back out into the storm and pretend this conversation had never happened. But when Jack looked at Elena's bruised face, at the resignation in her eyes, he thought about his own father. Joe Miller had been a mechanic too, and a drunk, and a man who'd believed that his fists were an acceptable tool for keeping his family in line. Jack still carried scars from those years, both visible and hidden. He'd spent his adult life swearing that he'd never stand by and watch someone else go through what he'd experienced. "One night," he said finally. "You can stay one night. But after that we'll figure something out," Elena said quickly. "I promise, Jack. We won't bring trouble to your door." But even as she said it, they both knew it was already too late for that. The moment Jack had opened his door to them, trouble had walked in wearing expensive clothes and a bruised face, carrying the weight of billions of dollars and the fury of one of the most powerful families in Texas. Outside, lightning split the sky again, and in the distance Jack could swear he heard the rumble of engines that had nothing to do with thunder. Elena heard it too. Her head snapped toward the front windows, and the color drained from her face. "They're coming," she whispered. "Oh God, they found us." Jack moved to the window and peered out through the rain-streaked glass. Sure enough, a line of black SUVs was making its way slowly down the street, their headlights cutting through the storm like predatory eyes. They were moving too slowly, too deliberately, clearly searching for something, or someone. "Back office," Jack said urgently. "Get Thomas and get in the back office. Lock the door and don't come out until I tell you." Elena grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his skin through his damp shirt. "Jack, if they find us here, they'll hurt you too. Robert doesn't leave loose ends." "Let me worry about that," Jack said, gently detaching her hand from his arm. "Just get your boy somewhere safe." Elena hesitated for another moment, then nodded and hurried toward the office. Jack heard the soft click of the lock engaging, and then he was alone in the main bay, with the sound of approaching engines and his own rapidly beating heart. The SUVs were closer now, close enough that he could make out individual vehicles. 3 of them expensive and black, and moving with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of professional drivers. They slowed even further as they approached his shop, and Jack held his breath. Then just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the vehicles picked up speed again and continued down the street, their taillights disappearing into the storm. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and moved away from the window. They'd been searching all right, but apparently they hadn't spotted anything suspicious about a lone auto shop with its lights on in the middle of the night. Or maybe they'd already checked this area and moved on. Either way, it had been too close for comfort. Jack knocked softly on the office door. "It's okay. They're gone." The lock clicked, and Elena emerged with Thomas in tow. The boy looked scared but trying to be brave, and Jack felt another stab of anger at the adults who'd put him in this situation. "They'll be back," Elena said quietly. "They'll keep looking until they find us." "Then we need to make sure they don't find you here," Jack replied. "Is there anywhere you can go? Anywhere they wouldn't think to look?" Elena shook her head. "Robert knows all my old friends, all the places I used to go, and I don't have enough cash to get far enough away to matter." Jack thought about that. Elena might not have cash, but she almost certainly had access to accounts that the Blackwoods couldn't touch immediately. Carter oil money maybe, or trusts that had been set up before her marriage. But accessing those accounts would leave a paper trail that could be followed. "What about your father's will?" Jack asked. "When Carter oil was passed down, didn't you inherit anything?" Elena's face went through a complicated series of expressions, surprise, hope, and then something that looked almost like fear. Yes. Daddy left me shares in the company, but Robert convinced me to sign them over to him after we were married. He said it would be better for tax purposes that we'd be managing them together anyway. And you believed him. "I was in love," Elena said simply, "and young, and stupid." Jack nodded. He'd seen it before, like wealthy men who used marriage as a way to consolidate power, to acquire assets that would have been harder to obtain through business deals. It was legal technically, but it was also predatory as hell. "But," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength, "there was something else. Something Robert doesn't know about." She reached into her blouse and pulled out a small pendant on a thin gold chain. It was elegant, but unremarkable, the kind of jewelry that might have sentimental value but wouldn't draw attention from thieves. "This was my father's," Elena said, holding the pendant up to the light. "He gave it to me just before he died. He said it was the key to everything he'd built, and that someday I might need it." Jack frowned. "What did he mean by that?" "I never knew. I thought it was just metaphorical, you know. A father's way of telling his daughter that she had the strength to handle whatever life threw at her. But now..." Elena's voice trailed off as she turned the pendant over in her hands. "Now I'm wondering if it was more literal than I thought." Thomas had been watching this exchange with the intense focus that children brought to adult mysteries. Now he spoke up, his voice small but clear. "Grandfather showed me a secret room once," he said. "In the big house before we moved to Uncle Robert's place. He said it was where he kept his most important papers." Elena stared at her son in shock. "Thomas, honey, when did Grandfather show you this room?" "The day before he went on his trip," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "The one where his plane crashed. He said someday I might need to remember where it was, in case something happened to you and Mama needed help." Elena's hands were shaking now, and Jack could see her mind racing through the implications of what Thomas was telling them. Carter Oil's founder, it seemed, had been a man who planned for contingencies, and if there was a secret room filled with important papers... "Thomas," Elena said carefully, "do you remember how to get to this room?" The boy nodded solemnly. "Grandfather made me practice. He said it was like a game, but I had to promise to keep it secret until it was really important. Elena looked at Jack, and he could see the hope and terror warring in her expression. If Thomas was right, if there really were documents hidden away that Robert didn't know about, it could change everything. But getting to them would mean going back into the heart of Blackwood territory, into the very place they'd just escaped from. "We can't," Jack said, reading her expression. "Elena, it's too dangerous. Even if this room exists, even if there's something there that could help you, the risk is worth it," Elena said firmly. "Jack, you don't understand. If there are documents that prove Robert forged my signature on those share transfers, or if there's evidence of other illegal activities, I could get my life back. Thomas could get his inheritance back. Or you could both end up dead." Elena flinched at his bluntness, but she didn't back down. "We're going to end up dead anyway if we keep running. Robert has too many resources, too many connections. Eventually he'll find us, and when he does..." She looked at Thomas, who was listening to every word with wide, frightened eyes. "I won't let my son grow up the way I did, walking on eggshells, afraid of setting off the wrong person's temper." Jack understood the sentiment. God knew he'd made his own share of promises about breaking cycles of violence, but understanding didn't make the plan any less insane. "Elena, you're talking about breaking into one of the most heavily secured compounds in Texas. The Blackwood estate isn't just a house, it's a fortress. There's security cameras, probably armed guards." "I know," Elena said quietly. "I lived there for 8 years. I know every inch of that place, every guard rotation, every blind spot in the camera system. And I know that Robert always gives the security staff Sunday nights off because he doesn't want witnesses to his recreational activities." The way she said recreational activities made Jack's stomach turn. He had a pretty good idea what she was talking about, and it explained a lot about the fear he'd seen in her eyes. "Today is Saturday," Elena continued. "If we move tomorrow night, we..." Jack interrupted. "Lady, I never agreed to we anything. I said you could stay one night, not that I was signing up for some kind of heist operation." But even as he said it, Jack knew he was fighting a losing battle. Elena wasn't just some random stranger anymore. She was a woman who'd trusted him with her most dangerous secret, who'd put her son's life in his hands. And Thomas, Christ Thomas, was just a kid who deserved better than the hand he'd been dealt. "I can't ask you to do this," Elena said, but there was something in her voice that suggested she was hoping he'd volunteer anyway. "You've already done more than anyone could expect. But Jack, I don't think I can do this alone." Outside, the storm was finally beginning to weaken, the thunder growing more distant, and the rain easing from a hammering downpour to a steady patter. Dawn was still hours away, but Jack could feel the night sliding toward morning, toward decisions that would determine the course of all their lives. He looked at Elena standing in his shabby office with her bruised face and her designer clothes and her desperate hope. He looked at Thomas, small and brave and carrying secrets that no child should have to bear. And he thought about the man he'd promised himself he would be, not his father's son, but something better. "Okay," he said finally, the words coming out before his common sense could stop them. "But we do this smart. We plan it right, we have backup plans for our backup plans, and at the first sign that things are going sideways, we abort. Deal?" Elena's face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since they'd met. "Deal." Thomas let out a little cheer, then quickly clapped his hands over his mouth, as if he'd forgotten they were supposed to be keeping quiet. The gesture was so purely childlike that Jack couldn't help but smile despite the magnitude of what they were planning. "All right then," Jack said, settling back into his chair and reaching for a notepad. "Let's figure out how to rob one of the most powerful families in Texas." as Elena began sketching the layout of the Blackwood estate from memory. Jack found himself wondering if this was how all life-changing decisions happened, not with grand proclamations or careful deliberation, but with small choices made in the middle of storms when ordinary people decided to do extraordinary things simply because it was the right thing to do. Outside, the first pale hint of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern horizon, and in the distance Jack could swear he heard the sound of engines again. But this time he didn't feel the same cold fear that had gripped him earlier. This time he felt something different. He felt ready. The coffee had grown cold hours ago, but Jack kept sipping it anyway, needing something to do with his hands, while Elena sketched security patterns and guard rotations with the precision of someone who'd spent years memorizing her own prison. Thomas had finally fallen asleep on the pull-out couch, one small hand still clutched around the empty cocoa mug, his face peaceful in a way that made Jack's chest ache. The main gate has cameras, but there's a service entrance on the north side that the landscaping crews use. Elena murmured, her pencil moving across the notepad with quick, confident strokes. Robert had it installed 2 years ago when he got tired of delivery trucks blocking the main driveway during his dinner parties. Motion sensors, Jack asked, studying the rough map she'd drawn. On the house itself, yes, but not on the grounds between the fence and the building. Robert was always more worried about someone breaking into the house than someone just walking around the property. Elena's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. He used to joke that trespassers would take one look at the place and realize they were outclassed. Jack could picture it, the kind of casual arrogance that came with having so much money that you couldn't imagine anyone being desperate enough to challenge you. It was the same blindness that had let Robert Blackwood convince himself that his wife would never find the courage to leave. "What about the secret room Thomas mentioned?" Jack asked. "Where exactly is it?" Elena glanced toward the couch where her son was sleeping, then lowered her voice even further. "If Thomas is remembering correctly, it should be in my father's old study. But Jack, that room has been sealed off since the merger between Carter Oil and Blackwood Industries. Robert had it turned into a storage space for his wine collection." "So we're not just breaking into a house," Jack said slowly. "We're breaking into a wine cellar that used to be your father's office, looking for a secret room that may or may not exist, hoping to find documents that may or may not prove your husband is a criminal. When you put it like that, it sounds completely insane." "Because it is completely insane." Elena set down her pencil and rubbed her temples, exhaustion finally catching up with her. In the harsh fluorescent light of the office, the bruise on her cheek looked even darker, and Jack could see other marks on her arms that he'd missed in the dim lighting earlier. The sight made his jaw clench with fresh anger. "Elena," he said gently, "how long has this been going on, really?" She was quiet for so long that Jack thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The first time he hit me was 3 months after our wedding. I was pregnant with Thomas, and I'd made some comment about wanting to name the baby after my father if it was a boy. Robert said I needed to understand that I was a Blackwood now, not a Carter, and that my old family loyalties were inappropriate." Jack felt his hands curl into fists. "And you stayed." "I was 23 years old, pregnant, and suddenly married to a man I realized I didn't know at all. But I convinced myself that it was just the stress of the merger, of combining our family's businesses. I thought he'd get better once things settled down. But he didn't. He got worse, much worse, and by then I was trapped. Robert made sure I had no access to my own money, no friends he didn't approve of, no life outside of being Mrs. Robert Blackwood. When Thomas was born, it got even harder to think about leaving. How do you take a baby and run when you have nowhere to go and no way to support yourself?" Jack had heard variations of this story before, usually from the wives and girlfriends of men who ended up in his neighborhood after their relationships had turned violent. The details changed, but the pattern was always the same: isolation control, the gradual erosion of a person's sense of their own worth and agency. "What changed?" he asked. "What finally made you realize you had to get out?" Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her cheek again. Last week, Robert came home from a business dinner in a particularly foul mood. Some deal had fallen through, and he was drunk and looking for someone to blame. Thomas had left one of his toy cars in the hallway, and Robert tripped over it. She paused, clearly struggling with the memory. He dragged Thomas out of bed and started screaming at him about being careless and disrespectful. And when Thomas started crying, Elena's voice broke slightly. Robert backhanded him, hard enough to split his lip and send him tumbling into the wall. Jesus Christ. Thomas just looked at me with this expression of complete shock and betrayal, like he couldn't understand why I wasn't protecting him. And I realized that I'd been so focused on surviving Robert's moods that I'd forgotten my first job was supposed to be keeping my son safe. Jack studied Elena's face, seeing the guilt and shame she was carrying alongside her fear. "So you ran." "I waited until Robert left for his weekly poker game with his business partners, packed one bag and walked out. I had about $300 in cash and my father's pendant, and that was it. We've been moving every few hours since then, staying in cheap motels and trying to figure out what to do next." "How did you end up here?" Elena smiled ruefully. "Pure chance. We were driving around looking for somewhere to wait out the storm, and your shop was the only place with lights on. I thought maybe we could just sit in your parking lot until morning, but then the rain got so bad." "Lucky for all of us," Jack said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Yes, helping Elena and Thomas was dangerous, possibly stupidly dangerous. But it was also the most important thing he'd done in years, maybe the most important thing he'd ever done. "Jack," Elena said quietly, "I need you to understand something. What we're planning tomorrow night, if it goes wrong, Robert won't just have us arrested. He'll have us killed. And he'll make sure the people who helped us disappear too." "I understand." "Do you?" Because Robert Blackwood isn't just some abusive husband. He's a man who's worth billions of dollars, who has senators and judges in his pocket, who owns half the police force in this city. If he decides we're a threat to him— Elena. Jack's voice was calm but firm. "I get it. I know what kind of people we're dealing with. But you know what I've spent my whole life being afraid of: men like Robert Blackwood. Men who think their money and their connections make them untouchable. And I'm tired of it." Elena stared at him with something that might have been admiration. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know, someone who would either turn us away immediately or try to take advantage of the situation somehow. In my world, people don't help strangers without expecting something in return." Jack thought about that, about the world Elena had grown up in, where every relationship was transactional, and every kindness came with a price tag. It explained a lot about why she'd been so suspicious when he'd first offered them shelter. "Your world sucks," he said simply. That earned him a genuine laugh, the first one he'd heard from her. "Yes, it really does." They worked in comfortable silence for a while after that, Elena filling in details about the estate's layout, while Jack tried to think through the logistics of what they were planning. It was like working on a particularly complex engine repair. You had to understand how all the pieces fit together before you could figure out which ones to take apart. Around 4 a.m, Elena finally set down her pencil and stretched, wincing, as the movement pulled at what were probably bruised ribs. "I think that's everything I can remember," she said, studying the detailed map they'd created together. The service entrance, the blind spots in the camera, coverage, the wine cellar that used to be Daddy's study. If Thomas is right about the secret room, if he's right, we'll find it, Jack said. And if he's wrong, we'll deal with that too. Elena nodded, but Jack could see the doubt creeping back into her expression. What if we get inside, and there's nothing there? What if my father's pendant is just a piece of jewelry, and Thomas's memory is just a child's fantasy? Then we're no worse off than we are right now, Jack pointed out. But Elena, what if you're wrong? What if there really are documents that prove Robert stole your inheritance? What if there's evidence of other crimes? Then I get my life back, Elena said quietly. And Thomas gets to grow up free. The weight of that possibility hung between them like a promise and a prayer. Jack found himself thinking about the men in his own family, his father with his quick fists and quicker temper, his grandfather who'd drunk himself to death rather than deal with his problems, the long line of Miller men who'd passed their anger and frustration down like a poisonous inheritance. Maybe it was time for someone to break the pattern. We should try to get some sleep, Jack said finally. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, and tomorrow night changes everything, Elena finished. Jack pulled a couple of blankets from his supply closet and made up a makeshift bed on the floor beside the couch where Thomas was sleeping. Elena curled up in the desk chair, still fully dressed, and Jack settled onto his improvised bedroll with his back against the wall, where he could see both the front and back entrances to the shop. But sleep was a long time coming. Every sound from the street made Jack's muscles tense. Every car that passed by made him wonder if this was the moment Robert Blackwood's people would find them. He lay in the dark, listening to Elena's breathing slowly even out, and Thomas's quiet snores, and tried not to think about all the ways their plan could go catastrophically wrong. When he finally did drift off, Jack dreamed of his father, not the violent drunk who'd made his childhood a nightmare, but the man Joe Miller had been on his good days when he was sober and trying to make amends. In the dream, his father was working on an engine, his hands sure and steady as he explained how each component worked together to create power. The thing about engines, Jackie, Dream Joe said without looking up from his work, is that they're only as strong as their weakest part. But when everything's working right, when all the pieces fit together, the way they're supposed to, they can move mountains. Jack woke to the sound of Thomas stirring on the couch and pale morning light filtering through the grimy windows of his office. Elena was already awake, sitting in the desk chair, with her arms wrapped around her knees, staring out at the new day, with the expression of someone trying to memorize the world in case she never saw it again. Sleep at all? Jack asked quietly. A little. Enough. Jack stretched, working out the kinks in his back from sleeping on the floor. How are you feeling about tonight? Elena was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Terrified, she said finally, but also hopeful. I haven't felt hopeful in a very long time. Thomas sat up on the couch, his hair sticking up in every direction, looking around the unfamiliar surroundings with the momentary confusion of someone waking up in a strange place. When his eyes found Elena, his face broke into a relieved smile. Mama, I thought maybe I dreamed it all. No, sweetheart. We're still here and Mr. Miller is still helping us. Thomas turned his attention to Jack, studying him with the frank curiosity of childhood. Are you really going to help us get into the big house? That's the plan, Jack said, impressed, despite himself by the boy's matter-of-fact acceptance of their situation. But Thomas, I need you to understand something. What we're doing tonight is very dangerous. If something goes wrong. I know, Thomas said solemnly. But grandfather's papers are important, aren't they? The ones that prove Uncle Robert is a bad man? Elena and Jack exchanged glances over the boy's head. It was sobering to realize how much Thomas understood about his family's situation, how much he'd absorbed during his short life about the dynamics of power and abuse. "Yes," Elena said gently. "They're very important. But Thomas, you won't be coming with us tonight. You'll stay here with Mr. Miller's sister where it's safe." "Maria doesn't know about this yet," Jack said, reaching for his phone. "But she will. And she'll take good care of you." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Jack's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Maria's name appeared on the screen, and Jack felt his stomach drop. His sister had an uncanny ability to sense when he was in trouble, and her timing was usually terrible. "I have to take this," he told Elena, then answered the call. "Hey, Maria." "Jack Miller, what the hell is going on?" His sister's voice was sharp with concern and barely suppressed anger. "I just got off the phone with Mrs. Nguyen from the Vietnamese restaurant down the street. She said there were black SUVs cruising the neighborhood last night, stopping to ask questions about strangers." Jack closed his eyes. He should have known the community network would pick up on unusual activity. In this part of Houston, people looked out for each other, which meant they also noticed when outsiders came around asking questions. "It's complicated," Jack said. "Complicated how, Jack, are you in some kind of trouble? Because if you are—" "I'm not in trouble," Jack said, technically telling the truth, "but I might need your help with something." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Maria had been cleaning up Jack's messes since they were children, and she'd developed a finely tuned radar for the kind of situations that usually ended with someone calling her to post bail or provide alibis. "What kind of help?" she asked suspiciously. Jack looked at Elena and Thomas, both watching him with expressions of barely concealed anxiety. He thought about trying to explain the situation over the phone, then decided that some conversations needed to happen in person. "Can you come over to the shop and, Maria, maybe clear your schedule for the next couple of days?" Another pause, longer this time. "Jack, you're scaring me." "I know, but I promise this is important. More important than anything I've ever asked you to do." "I'll be there in an hour," Maria said finally. "And Jack, whatever this is about, we're going to figure it out together, okay?" "Okay," Jack said, and felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. Whatever else happened, he wouldn't be facing it alone. After he hung up, Elena looked at him with concern. "Are you sure she'll help? This isn't exactly the kind of favor most people are comfortable with." "You don't know Maria," Jack said. "She's been fighting other people's battles since she was 12 years old. If she thinks what we're doing is right, she'll move heaven and earth to make it happen. And if she doesn't think it's right—" Jack considered that. Maria had strong opinions about right and wrong, and she wasn't shy about expressing them. But she also had an even stronger opinion about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. "She'll still help," he said confidently, "but she'll lecture me about it for the next 20 years. Thomas giggled at that, the sound bright and unexpected in the tense atmosphere of the office. It was amazing how resilient kids could be, how they could find moments of joy even in the middle of chaos. "I like her already," Elena said, and Jack could hear the relief in her voice. The prospect of having another ally, especially one who knew the area and had connections in the community, was clearly a comfort. While they waited for Maria to arrive, Jack made another pot of coffee and scrounged up some stale donuts from the vending machine in the garage next door. It wasn't much of a breakfast, but it was better than nothing, and Thomas attacked his chocolate-glazed donut with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been living on gas station snacks for the past week. "Mr. Miller," Thomas said, around a mouthful of donut, "what kind of cars do you like to work on?" "All kinds." Jack said, settling into his chair with his coffee. But I guess I have a soft spot for the old muscle cars. The ones from the 60s and 70s when they built engines that could really move. Like a 67 Mustang. Exactly like a 67 Mustang. You know cars? Thomas nodded proudly. Grandfather had one. A red one with white racing stripes. He used to take me for drives on Sunday mornings before church. Elena's face softened at the memory. Daddy loved that car. He always said it reminded him of when he was young and thought he could take on the world. What happened to it? Jack asked. Robert sold it, Elena said quietly. About a year after Daddy died. He said it was impractical to keep a car that was just for show. Jack felt another flash of anger at Robert Blackwood's casual cruelty. Selling a dead man's beloved car wasn't just about money. It was about erasing the past, cutting Elena off from her memories of her father. That's a shame, Jack said. Cars like that, they're not just machines. They're pieces of history. Grandfather said the same thing, Thomas agreed. He said every car has a story, and if you know how to listen, it'll tell you where it's been. Before Jack could respond, he heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel outside, followed by a sharp knock on the front door. Maria had made good time. That'll be my sister, Jack said, getting up to let her in. Fair warning, she's going to have a lot of questions. Maria Ramirez looked nothing like her brother. Where Jack was tall and lean, Maria was compact and fierce with graying black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of direct gaze that had intimidated prosecutors and social workers for the better part of 20 years. She worked as a paralegal for a legal aid organization, fighting for people who couldn't afford to fight for themselves, and she had exactly zero patience for bullshit. She took one look at Elena's bruised face and Thomas's expensive clothes, then turned to Jack with an expression that promised a very long conversation later. Okay, she said without preamble. Who's trying to kill you this time? Despite everything, Jack found himself smiling. Trust Maria to cut straight to the heart of the matter. Maria, I'd like you to meet Elena and Thomas. Elena Thomas, this is my sister Maria. Maria's expression softened slightly as she looked at Thomas, but her eyes remained sharp as they moved back to Elena. Let me guess. Abusive husband, nowhere to go, and Jack's decided to play white knight. Something like that, Elena said, and Jack was impressed by how calmly she met Maria's challenging stare. Though the situation is a bit more complicated than usual. It always is. Maria settled into the remaining chair and fixed Jack with a look that promised retribution. All right, little brother, start talking. So Jack did. He told Maria about finding Elena and Thomas in the storm, about the black SUVs that had been searching the neighborhood, about Elena's true identity and the family she was running from. He explained about Thomas's memory of a secret room and their plan to break into the Blackwood estate that night. Through it all, Maria listened without interruption, her expression growing more and more grim as the full scope of the situation became clear. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, she said, when Jack finished. You want to break into the home of one of the most powerful families in Texas, based on an 8-year-old's memory of something his grandfather showed him 5 years ago, in the hope of finding documents that may or may not exist. That's about the size of it, Jack admitted. Maria was quiet for a long moment, studying Elena's face with the calculating gaze of someone who'd spent years learning to read people. The bruises are fresh, she said finally, less than a week old, and the way you're holding yourself suggests cracked ribs, probably from being kicked while you were down. Elena's composure cracked slightly. How did you... I've seen it before. Too many times. Maria's voice was gentler now, but her eyes remained hard. The question is, what do you really want here, justice or revenge? It was a fair question, and Jack found himself holding his breath as he waited for Elena's answer. There was a difference between seeking justice and seeking vengeance, and that difference would determine whether Maria was willing to help them. I want my son to be safe, Elena said simply. I want him to grow up in a world where he doesn't have to be afraid of the people who are supposed to love him. If that means bringing down Robert and his father, then yes, I want justice. But not revenge. Justice. Maria nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with the answer. And you, she said, turning to Thomas. What do you want? Thomas looked between Elena and Maria, clearly understanding that this was an important moment. I want to help my mama, he said seriously, and I want to find grandfather's papers so the bad men can't hurt us anymore. The bad men, Maria repeated thoughtfully. Is that how you think of your stepfather and his family? Thomas nodded solemnly. Uncle Robert hurt Mama, and he hurt me too. Grandfather always said that people who hurt other people are bad no matter how much money they have. Maria's expression shifted, and Jack saw something that looked like approval flicker across her face. Your grandfather sounds like a smart man. He was, Thomas said proudly, and he taught me lots of things, like how to remember important stuff even when other people don't want you to. That caught Maria's attention. What kind of important stuff? Thomas glanced at Elena, who nodded encouragingly. Like where he kept his special papers, and what the pendant means, and why it's important that nobody else knows until it's time. Maria looked at the pendant hanging around Elena's neck, then back at Thomas. Can you tell me about the pendant? Thomas shook his head. Not yet. Grandfather said I should only tell when we're in the special room because that's when it'll be safe. Maria raised an eyebrow at Jack, who shrugged. They were all operating on faith at this point. Faith that Thomas's memories were accurate. Faith that the pendant meant something more than sentimental value. Faith that they could pull off what amounted to an impossible mission. All right, Maria said finally. I'm in. Just like that, Jack asked, surprised by how quickly she'd made the decision. Just like that. Maria's smile was sharp and dangerous. Jack, I've spent 15 years watching rich men use the legal system to get away with murder. If there's a chance to take down someone like Robert Blackwood using his own crimes against him, well, that's the kind of justice I can get behind. Elena let out a breath she'd been holding. Thank you, both of you. I know what we're asking. You're not asking, Maria interrupted. You're offering. The chance to nail a bastard who thinks his money makes him untouchable. That's not a favor, sweetheart. That's a gift. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Maria made a series of phone calls using her network of contacts to gather intelligence about the Blackwood estate's security protocols and to arrange for backup plans in case things went wrong. Elena and Jack refined their infiltration route, going over every detail until they could both navigate the estate's grounds blindfolded. And through it all, Thomas sat quietly in the corner, playing with a set of toy cars Jack had found in his desk drawer, occasionally offering corrections or additions to their plans, with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who'd lived in that house for most of his young life. As the sun climbed higher and the day grew warmer, Jack found himself thinking about the dream he'd had about his father, explaining how engines worked, how all the pieces had to fit together perfectly to create power. Looking around his office at this unlikely group of conspirators, he wondered if this was what his father had meant. Not just mechanical power, but the kind of power that came from people working together toward a common goal. The kind of power that could move mountains or bring down empires. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the temperature outside had climbed to a brutal 98 degrees, and the air conditioning unit in Jack's office was fighting a losing battle against the Texas heat. Maria had returned from her reconnaissance mission with news that was both encouraging and terrifying. "The good news is that your memory is spot on," she told Elena, spreading a series of photographs across Jack's desk. "I drove past the estate twice, once as a lost tourist and once as someone looking for house cleaning work. The service entrance is exactly where you said it would be, and there's definitely a gap in the camera coverage on the north side of the property." "And the bad news?" Jack asked, though he could already read the answer in his sister's expression. "The bad news is that Robert Blackwood is home. I saw his car in the driveway, and there were at least 3 security guards visible from the road. If we're doing this tonight, we're going to be walking into the lion's den while the lion is having dinner." Elena went pale, but her voice remained steady. "Robert usually spends Sunday evenings in his study, going over business reports and making phone calls to his contacts in Asia. If we time it right, he'll be on the opposite side of the house from where we need to be." "Usually," Maria emphasized. "But Elena, if something spooked him, if he knows you're in the area, his routine might be completely different tonight." Thomas looked up from his toy cars, his young face serious. "Uncle Robert gets really angry when things don't go the way he wants them to. If he thinks someone's trying to trick him, he gets scary." The understatement hung in the air like a physical presence. Jack found himself thinking about the bruises on Elena's face, about the split lip that had finally driven her to run, and felt his resolve harden. Whatever risks they were taking tonight, they were nothing compared to the risk of letting Elena and Thomas fall back into Robert Blackwood's hands. "There's something else," Maria continued, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "I made some calls to friends who work in the courthouse, people who handle property records and estate filings. Elena, did you know that your father's will was amended 3 times in the months before his death?" Elena's head snapped up. "That's impossible. Daddy only had one will, the one he'd had since I was a child. He used to joke that it was so simple, even a lawyer couldn't mess it up." According to the official records, the final version was filed just 2 weeks before the plane crash. And in that version, your shares in Carter Oil were placed in a trust that would be managed by your husband in the event of your father's death. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Jack watched the color drain from her face as the implications sank in. "Robert knew," she whispered. "He knew Daddy was going to die." "Now hold on," Jack said quickly. "That's a hell of a leap. People amend their wills all the time, especially when their daughters get married. It doesn't necessarily mean—" "Jack." Elena's voice was deadly quiet. "My father hated Robert. He only agreed to our marriage because I begged him to, and even then he made it clear that he thought I was making a mistake. There is no way he would have voluntarily put Robert in control of the family business." Maria nodded grimly. "That's what I thought you'd say. Which is why I also had my friend pull the records for the lawyer who filed those amendments." "Guess who was paying his bills?" "Blackwood Industries," Elena said, though it wasn't really a question. Blackwood Industries. The same firm that handled the merger between Carter Oil and Blackwood Industries 6 months after your father's death. The same firm that's been Robert's personal legal counsel for the past decade. Jack felt like he was watching the pieces of a massive puzzle finally click into place. So Robert didn't just steal Elena's inheritance after the fact. He planned the whole thing before her father even died. "Which means he had to know the plane was going to crash," Elena said, her voice barely audible. "Which means—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The implication was clear and horrifying. They weren't just dealing with domestic abuse and financial fraud. They were potentially dealing with murder. Thomas had gone very still in his corner, his toy cars forgotten. When he spoke, his voice was small and frightened. "Did Uncle Robert hurt Grandfather?" Elena crossed the room in 3 quick steps and pulled her son into her arms. "I don't know, sweetheart. But if he did, we're going to make sure everyone knows the truth." "Is that why Grandfather hid the papers?" Thomas asked. "Because he knew Uncle Robert was a bad man." "Maybe," Elena said softly. "Maybe Grandfather suspected something was wrong and wanted to make sure we'd have proof if we ever needed it." Jack exchanged glances with Maria, both of them thinking the same thing. If Elena's father had suspected that Robert was planning something, if he'd had time to hide evidence before his death, then tonight's mission had just become infinitely more important. They weren't just looking for documents that might help Elena regain her inheritance. They were potentially looking for evidence of premeditated murder. "This changes things," Maria said quietly. "If Robert killed your father, if there's proof of that hidden in the house, then we're not just dealing with a domestic abuser anymore. We're dealing with someone who's killed to protect his secrets and won't hesitate to kill again." Elena's arms tightened around Thomas, and Jack could see the fear and determination warring in her expression. "All the more reason to find those documents. If Robert murdered my father, he needs to pay for it." "And if he didn't?" Jack asked. "If we break into that house and find nothing, or if we get caught in the process?" "Then at least we'll have tried," Elena said simply. "Jack, I've spent 8 years living with a man who I now realize is capable of murder. I've watched him manipulate and control and hurt people, and I've done nothing to stop him because I was too scared and too isolated to fight back. I won't make that mistake again." The conviction in her voice was absolute, and Jack found himself nodding. Whatever else happened tonight, Elena had already made her choice. The only question now was whether he and Maria were going to stand with her or leave her to face this alone. "All right," Jack said finally, "but we do this smart. We go in, we find the room, we get what we need, and we get out. No heroics, no confrontations, no trying to settle scores. This is a surgical strike, not a war." "Agreed," Elena said immediately. "And if something goes wrong," Maria added, "if we get separated or if Robert shows up unexpectedly, we abort. Elena, you and Jack get out of that house by whatever means necessary, and we regroup later." Elena hesitated at that, clearly not liking the idea of running again. But after a moment she nodded. "If it means keeping Thomas safe, yes." They spent the next several hours going over the plan in excruciating detail. Maria had managed to acquire blueprints of the Blackwood estate from a contact at the city planning office, and they used those to refine their route through the house. Elena walked them through the layout of her father's old study, describing every piece of furniture and every architectural detail she could remember. "The room was wood-paneled," she explained, sketching the space from memory. "Dark walnut with built-in bookshelves on 3 walls. Daddy's desk was positioned so he could look out the window while he worked, and there was a fireplace on the far wall with a portrait of my great-grandfather above it." "Any obvious places where a secret room might be hidden?" Jack asked. Elena shook her head. "That's what I can't figure out. The room wasn't that large, maybe 15 feet by 20 feet, and I spent plenty of time in there as a child. If there was a hidden door or a movable panel, I would have noticed it." "Unless it was designed not to be obvious," Maria suggested. "Secret rooms in old houses were usually built to be completely invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for." Thomas had been listening to this conversation with growing excitement, and now he spoke up with the confidence of someone who'd been waiting for his moment to contribute. "Grandfather showed me how it worked," he said proudly. "You have to use the pendant, and you have to know the special words." Elena turned to stare at her son. "What special words?" The ones grandfather made me memorize. He said they were like a password, and I should never tell anyone unless we were in the room, and it was really, really important. Jack felt his pulse quicken. Thomas, can you tell us now? It would help us know what to look for. Thomas shook his head solemnly. Grandfather said the words only work in the special place. If I say them somewhere else, they won't mean anything. Elena looked frustrated, but Jack found himself impressed by the boy's determination to follow his grandfather's instructions exactly. It suggested that whatever Carter had hidden, he'd taken elaborate precautions to make sure it would only be found by the right people at the right time. Okay, Jack said. So we get into the house, we get to the study, and then Thomas guides us through whatever his grandfather taught him. But Thomas, he crouched down so he was at eye level with the boy. Are you absolutely certain you remember everything? Because we might only get one chance at this. Thomas nodded seriously. I remember. Grandfather made me practice lots of times. He said remembering was the most important job anyone could have. As the afternoon wore on, Jack found himself growing increasingly nervous about what they were planning. The rational part of his mind kept pointing out all the ways their plan could go wrong: security guards, motion sensors, neighbors who might spot them, Robert himself, discovering them in the act. But every time he looked at Elena's bruised face or saw the way Thomas flinched at unexpected noises, his resolve strengthened. At 6 o'clock, Maria left to make final preparations, promising to return with the supplies they'd need for the night's work. Elena spent the time teaching Thomas a simple code they could use to communicate if they got separated, while Jack triple-checked the tools and equipment they'd be taking with them. Nervous? Elena asked as Jack tested the beam of a small flashlight for the third time. Terrified, Jack admitted. You, the same. Elena managed a small smile, but also excited in a strange way. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm actually doing something instead of just surviving. Jack understood that feeling. He'd spent most of his adult life fixing other people's broken machines, keeping his head down and avoiding trouble. Tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was going to be the one causing trouble instead of cleaning up after it. Maria returned just as the sun was setting, carrying a canvas bag that clinked ominously when she set it down. Wire cutters, lock picks, a glass cutter, and a few other toys that I borrowed from a friend who works private security, she announced. Nothing too sophisticated, but enough to get you through a standard residential alarm system. You have friends who work private security? Jack asked. I have friends everywhere, Maria replied with a grin. One of the advantages of working in the legal system, you meet all kinds of interesting people. They ate a quick dinner of Chinese takeout, though none of them had much appetite. Thomas picked at his lo mein, with the distracted air of someone whose mind was elsewhere, and Elena barely touched her food at all. Jack forced himself to eat, knowing he'd need the energy for what lay ahead, but everything tasted like cardboard. As they ate, Maria briefed them on the final details of the plan. She'd identified 3 different escape routes from the estate, along with safe houses where they could regroup if something went wrong. She'd also arranged for a friend to monitor police radio frequencies just in case someone called in a break-in. If this goes bad, she warned, it's going to go bad fast. The Blackwoods have enough influence to mobilize half the Houston Police Department if they want to. Our window for getting clear will be maybe 10 minutes, 15 at the outside. Then we better not waste time, Elena said quietly. At 9 o'clock, they began their final preparations. Elena changed into dark clothes that Maria had brought: black jeans, a dark sweater, and sneakers that would be quiet on hard surfaces. Jack dressed similarly, though he also strapped on a tool belt containing the lockpicks and other equipment they might need. Thomas would be staying with Maria safely away from the estate while his mother and Jack attempted to recover his grandfather's hidden documents. The boy had initially protested this arrangement, insisting that he needed to be there to remember the special words and operate the pendant. But Elena had been firm. "Sweetheart, the most important thing is keeping you safe. If something happens to me tonight, I need to know that you're somewhere Uncle Robert can't find you." "But Mama," Thomas had argued, "what if you can't find the secret room without me? Then we'll figure out another way," Elena had promised. "But I won't put you in danger again. Not ever." In the end, Thomas had accepted the decision with the resigned grace of a child who'd learned not to argue with adult decisions even when he disagreed with them. But Jack could see the worry in the boy's eyes, the fear that his mother might not come back. At 10:30, they loaded into Jack's pickup truck and began the drive toward the Blackwood estate. The neighborhood where the wealthy lived was a world away from Jack's auto shop, tree-lined streets with perfect lawns, houses that looked more like museums than homes, the kind of place where a beat-up pickup truck would stand out like a neon sign. "There," Elena said, as they turned onto Blackwood Street. "The house with the iron gates and the circular driveway." Jack whistled low under his breath. The Blackwood mansion was even more impressive than he'd imagined, a sprawling Georgian colonial that probably had more square footage than his entire neighborhood. Floodlights illuminated the perfectly manicured grounds, and he could see the gleam of security cameras mounted on the gate posts. "Jesus," he muttered. "How are we supposed to get into Fort Knox?" "The service entrance is around back," Elena reminded him. "And remember, Robert's security is designed to keep out random criminals, not people who know the layout of the house." Jack hoped she was right. He drove past the estate, slowly trying to look like someone who was lost rather than someone casing the joint. As they passed the main gate, he caught a glimpse of a black SUV parked in the circular driveway, the same kind of vehicle that had been prowling his neighborhood the night before. "Company," he noted. Elena followed his gaze and her face tightened. "Robert's father. Harrison only visits when there's serious business to discuss." "What kind of serious business?" "The kind that usually ends with someone getting hurt," Elena said grimly. "Jack, maybe we should call this off. If Harrison's here, if they're having some kind of family meeting." "Elena." Jack's voice was calm but firm. "Do you want to spend the rest of your life running? Because that's what you'll be doing if we don't find those documents tonight. Running and hiding and looking over your shoulder, waiting for them to find you." Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring at the house where she'd lived for 8 years, where she'd been controlled and manipulated and ultimately brutalized. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "You're right. Let's finish this." Jack parked the truck 3 blocks away in the parking lot of a 24-hour convenience store, where it would blend in with other vehicles. From there, they walked back toward the estate, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the pools of light cast by street lamps. The service entrance Elena had described was exactly where she'd said it would be, a simple chain-link gate set into a section of fence that was partially hidden by overgrown bushes. More importantly, it was in a blind spot between 2 security cameras, just as she'd remembered. "Motion sensors," Jack whispered as he examined the gate's lock. "Not on the fence," Elena replied. "Robert was always more worried about people getting into the house than just onto the property." Jack made quick work of the lock with Maria's wire cutters, and they slipped through the gate onto the Blackwood estate. The grounds were even more impressive up close, acres of perfectly maintained lawn, ornamental gardens, and walking paths that probably cost more to maintain than Jack made in a year. They moved carefully across the open ground, staying low and keeping to the darkest areas. Elena led the way with the confidence of someone who'd walked these paths hundreds of times, guiding them around the security cameras and motion sensors with practiced ease. The house itself was a monument to wealth and power, 3 stories of Georgian grandeur, with more windows than Jack could count. Light spilled from several of the rooms, indicating that the family was indeed home and active. "Daddy's study is on the first floor at the back of the house," Elena whispered as they approached the building. "The windows face the garden, and there's a French door that leads onto the patio." Alarmed, "The door itself, yes, but the window next to it has a faulty sensor that Robert never bothered to fix. He always said it wasn't worth the expense since that side of the house faced the interior of the property." Jack shook his head at the casual arrogance that had led Robert to leave such an obvious vulnerability in his security system. But then again, when you had enough money and power, you probably assumed that no one would be crazy enough to break into your home. Tonight, Robert Blackwood was going to learn the difference between being rich and being smart. Elena led them to the window she'd described, and Jack could immediately see what she meant about the faulty sensor. The magnetic contact that should have been flush against the window frame was slightly askew, leaving a gap that would prevent it from registering when the window was opened. "Someone's been here recently," Jack observed, noting the disturbed dust on the windowsill. "Probably the cleaning service," Elena said. "They come twice a week to maintain the rooms that aren't regularly used." Jack used the glass cutter to create a small hole near the window latch, then reached through to unlock it. The window slid open with barely a whisper of sound, and they were inside. The room they entered was exactly as Elena had described: wood-paneled walls, built-in bookshelves, and a massive desk positioned to take advantage of the garden view. But it was also clearly different from the study Elena remembered, where there had once been her father's books and personal effects. There were now rows of wine bottles and a climate control system that hummed quietly in the background. "It's all wrong," Elena whispered, staring around the transformed space. "This isn't how Daddy left it." "Robert turned it into a wine cellar, remember?" Jack pointed out. "But the basic structure should be the same. Can you tell where the secret room might be?" Elena moved around the space slowly, her eyes searching the walls for any sign of the hidden entrance Thomas had described. But the wine storage systems and climate control equipment had changed the room so dramatically that it was hard to reconcile it with her childhood memories. "I don't know," she admitted, frustration creeping into her voice. "Everything's different. The bookshelves are gone, the fireplace has been covered over, even the floor has been changed." Jack felt his heart sink. They'd come this far, taken enormous risks to get into the house, only to discover that Robert's renovations might have destroyed any access to the secret room. But then Elena's hand went to the pendant around her neck, and her expression changed. "Wait," she said softly. "Thomas said you need the pendant to make it work. Maybe." She approached the wall where the fireplace had been, running her hands over the wood paneling. "Maybe the mechanism is still here, just hidden." Jack joined her, examining the wall more closely. The paneling was definitely original, the same dark walnut Elena had described, though it had been partially covered by the wine storage systems. And when he pressed against certain sections, he could feel a slight give that suggested hollow spaces behind the wood. "There," Elena said suddenly, pointing to a section of paneling near what had been the fireplace mantel. "Do you see that the wood grain doesn't quite match the rest of the wall?" Jack looked where she was pointing and saw what she meant. There was a subtle difference in the wood pattern, so slight that you'd never notice it unless you were looking for it. But once you saw it, it was obvious that this section of paneling was separate from the rest. "How does the pendant work?" he asked. Elena lifted the chain from around her neck and examined the pendant more closely. In the dim light of the study, Jack could see that it wasn't just a simple piece of jewelry. There were tiny engravings on the surface so small they were almost invisible, and what looked like a small protrusion on one side. It's some kind of key, Elena realized. Look, there's a groove on the side that matches. She pressed the pendant against a barely visible indentation in the wood paneling, and there was a soft click. Nothing happened. Thomas said you need special words too, Jack reminded her. Elena's face fell. But I don't know what they are. Thomas said he'd only tell us when we were in the room, and now... She was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the study. Heavy footsteps moving with the measured pace of someone who belonged in the house. Jack grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her behind one of the wine storage units, just as the study door opened and light spilled into the room. "I'm telling you, Harrison, someone's been in the house," a man's voice said. Jack recognized it immediately as Robert Blackwood's distinctive baritone, cultured and confident, and carrying the kind of authority that came from never being contradicted. "The security system shows no breaches," another voice replied, older, more gravelly, but with the same undertone of absolute power. "Harrison Blackwood, the patriarch of the family empire." Then they bypassed the system somehow. The window in Elena's father's old study was unlocked, and I know it was secured this morning. Jack felt Elena go rigid beside him as they listened to the two men enter the room. They were trapped, hidden behind a wine rack, while the two most dangerous men in Texas stood less than 10 feet away. "Even if someone did get in," Harrison was saying, "what could they possibly find? You stripped this room of anything important years ago." "I stripped it of everything I could find," Robert corrected. "But Elena's father was a paranoid old bastard. There's no telling what he might have hidden away before he died." Jack felt rather than saw Elena's reaction to hearing her father described that way. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid, and he could sense the rage building in her like pressure in a boiler. "The will was clear," Harrison continued. "Everything Carter owned became part of our holdings when he died. There's no outstanding claim on any of it." "The will we created was clear," Robert said. "But if the old man suspected what we were planning, if he hid evidence of the original will or any of the other documents, then we deal with it the same way we've dealt with every other problem." Harrison's voice was cold and matter-of-fact. "Permanently." Jack felt Elena's body go completely still beside him. They were listening to a confession, not just to fraud, but to murder. Everything Elena had suspected about her father's death was true. "Speaking of problems," Robert continued, "any word on Elena and the boy? My contacts in the police department say there's been no sign of them since they left the city. But I've got teams checking bus stations, airports, train terminals. They can't stay hidden forever." "When you find them," Robert's voice carried a note of anticipation that made Jack's skin crawl. "When we find them, we'll make sure they don't cause any more trouble," Harrison finished. "Elena knows too much, and the boy is a liability we can't afford to maintain." They were talking about killing a woman and child with the same casual tone other people might use to discuss the weather. Jack felt his own rage building to match Elena's, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't help anyone right now. "There's something else," Robert said. "I've been thinking about what Elena might have taken when she left. She didn't have access to our accounts, but there were some personal effects of her father's that I never bothered to dispose of. Such as a pendant, some kind of family heirloom that the old man was always wearing. I remember him giving it to Elena just before he died, said something about it being the key to everything he'd built." Jack felt Elena's hand move instinctively to her throat, where the pendant had been hanging until a few minutes ago. Now it was pressed against the wood paneling, potentially the only thing standing between them and the evidence they needed. "You think it's important?" Harrison asked. I think Carter was the kind of man who would hide important things in plain sight. If there's some kind of secret compartment or hidden room in this house, that pendant might be the key to finding it. The two men moved closer to where Jack and Elena were hiding, and Jack could hear them examining the wine storage systems with the thoroughness of people who suspected they might not be alone. The cleaning service was here yesterday, Robert mused, but they wouldn't have had any reason to come into this room. Unless someone paid them to, Harrison suggested. Money talks, Robert, even to people who work for us. Jack held his breath as footsteps approached their hiding place. If the two men decided to search behind the wine racks, there would be nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. He tensed, preparing to fight if necessary, though he knew that two unarmed people had little chance against men who undoubtedly carried weapons and had backup on call. But then from somewhere in the house came the sound of a telephone ringing. "Damn," Robert muttered. "That's the secure line. Probably our contact in the DA's office." "We should take that," Harrison agreed. "But Robert, double the security on this place. If Elena is desperate enough to come back here, she might try something stupid." "Already done. I've got men watching the roads, and the house is locked down tight." The footsteps moved away from the wine racks, heading back toward the door. Jack waited until he heard the door close and the footsteps fade down the hallway, before allowing himself to breathe again. "Did you hear that?" Elena whispered, her voice shaking with fury. "They killed him. They killed my father, and they're planning to kill us too." "I heard," Jack replied grimly. "Which means we need to find those documents fast and get out of here. Can you remember anything Thomas said about the special words?" Elena shook her head, tears of frustration streaming down her face. "He was so careful about following his grandfather's instructions. He wouldn't tell anyone the words unless we were all together in the room." Jack looked at the pendant still pressed against the indentation in the wood paneling and tried to think. Thomas had said the words were like a password, something his grandfather had made him memorize. What kind of password would a man like Carter choose? Something meaningful, something that would be significant to his family, but meaningless to outsiders. "Elena," he said suddenly, "what was your father's full name?" "James Alexander Carter, but everyone called him Alex." "And your mother?" "Sarah Elizabeth Carter. She died when I was 12. Jack nodded, filing away the information. "What about family mottos or sayings that your father liked to use?" Elena thought for a moment. "He used to say that the measure of a man wasn't how much money he made, but how many people he helped along the way. And he always told me that Carter women were stronger than Carter men because we had to be." And none of those sounded like the kind of concise password a 9-year-old would be able to remember and recite accurately. Jack was starting to wonder if they'd have to abandon the mission and try to find another way to prove Robert's crimes. But then Elena's face suddenly lit up with understanding. "Wait," she said urgently. "There was something else. A phrase Daddy taught me when I was little, something he said his father had taught him. It was about the family business, about how oil was just buried sunshine waiting to be set free." "What were the exact words?" Elena closed her eyes, concentrating. "From darkness into light, from earth to sky, the treasure waits for those who know the way." She opened her eyes and looked at Jack with growing excitement. "That's it. That has to be it." Jack felt a surge of hope. The phrase certainly sounded like the kind of thing Carter might have used as a password, meaningful to the family, but cryptic enough that outsiders wouldn't understand its significance. "Try it," he urged. Elena spoke the words clearly and carefully, her voice carrying the same reverent tone Thomas might have used. "From darkness into light, from earth to sky, the treasure waits for those who know the way." For a moment, nothing happened. Then there was a soft, mechanical clicking sound, like gears engaging, and the section of wood paneling swung inward on hidden hinges. Behind it was a small room, no larger than a walk-in closet lined with filing cabinets and document storage boxes. And sitting on a small desk in the center of the room was a thick manila envelope with Elena's name written on it in her father's distinctive handwriting. "My God," Elena breathed. "He really did it. Daddy really hid everything." They entered the secret room quickly, Elena grabbing the envelope with her name, while Jack surveyed the filing cabinets. Each drawer was labeled with dates and categories, legal documents, business correspondence, financial records going back decades. "There," Elena said, pointing to a filing cabinet labeled Blackwood Merger, Original Documents. "That's what we need." Jack pulled open the drawer and found himself looking at hundreds of documents, all meticulously organized and labeled. There were copies of the original merger agreements, financial projections, correspondence between Carter and various law firms, and most importantly, a complete copy of Carter's original will. "Elena," Jack said urgently, "look at this." She joined him at the filing cabinet, and together they read through the original will. It was exactly as Elena had suspected. Her father had left her controlling interest in Carter Oil, with specific provisions that her inheritance could never be transferred to her husband without her explicit written consent, witnessed by at least 3 independent parties. "This proves Robert forged my signature," Elena said, her voice filled with wonder and rage in equal measure. "And look at this." She pointed to another section of the will. "Daddy left detailed instructions for an independent audit of the company's finances if there were ever any questions about the legitimacy of the merger." Jack pulled out more files, finding evidence of illegal campaign contributions, bribes to local officials, and most damning of all, a series of memos detailing Robert and Harrison's plan to arrange Carter's accident. "Jesus Christ," Jack muttered as he read through the documents. "They planned the whole thing months in advance. The forged will the fake merger documents, even the plane crash." Elena was reading the envelope her father had left for her, tears streaming down her face. "He knew," she said softly. "Daddy knew they were going to kill him, and he made sure there would be evidence. Listen to this." She read from the letter in her father's handwriting. "My dearest Elena, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass, and Robert Blackwood has shown his true nature. In this room you will find everything you need to reclaim what is rightfully yours, and to make sure that justice is served. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this, but I pray that I've given you the tools to protect yourself." The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the study interrupted her. Multiple sets of footsteps moving with the purposeful rhythm of people conducting a search. "Time to go," Jack said urgently, grabbing as many files as he could carry. "They're coming back." Elena stuffed her father's letter into her jacket and grabbed another handful of documents. They had only seconds before Robert and his security team would be back in the study, and the hidden door was their only way out. But as they prepared to leave the secret room, Elena paused and looked back at the filing cabinets they were leaving behind. "There's so much more," she said. "Evidence of other crimes, other victims. If we leave now. If we stay, we're dead," Jack pointed out. "We'll come back for the rest, but right now we need to get out of here alive." Elena nodded reluctantly and followed him out of the secret room. Jack closed the hidden door behind them, making sure the pendant was properly seated so the entrance would remain concealed. With any luck, Robert and Harrison wouldn't realize their secret had been discovered until it was too late. They made it to the window just as the study door opened again. This time, Robert wasn't alone. Jack could hear at least 3 other voices, all of them speaking in the clipped professional tones of security personnel. Check every inch of this room, Robert was saying. If there's a way in that we don't know about, I want it found. Jack and Elena slipped through the window and onto the patio, the stolen documents clutched tightly in their hands. Behind them, they could hear the security team beginning their systematic search of the study, and Jack knew it was only a matter of time before they discovered the secret room. But they had what they'd come for. In their hands was proof of murder fraud and conspiracy that would bring down one of the most powerful families in Texas. The question now was whether they could get far enough away to use it. As they moved across the estate grounds, staying low and keeping to the shadows, Jack found himself thinking about the dream he'd had about his father. All the pieces fitting together to create power. That's exactly what was happening here. Elena's courage, Thomas's memory, Maria's connections, and his own stubborn refusal to let bullies win. Separately, they were just ordinary people. Together, they were something that even the Blackwoods couldn't stop. The escape route Elena had planned took them around the back of the house and through a section of ornamental garden that provided cover from the security cameras. They were almost to the fence when floodlights suddenly blazed to life across the entire estate, turning night into harsh artificial day. "Run!" Jack said simply, and they ran. Behind them, alarms began wailing across the Blackwood estate, their shrill notes cutting through the night like mechanical screams. Jack grabbed Elena's hand and pulled her toward the fence, the stolen documents clutched against his chest with his free arm. The floodlights had turned their careful route into a nightmare of harsh shadows and blinding illumination. But there was no time for stealth now. "The service gate!" Elena gasped as they sprinted across the manicured lawn. "If we can reach the service gate!" Her words were cut off by the sound of dogs barking deep-throated roars that spoke of animals bred for hunting rather than companionship. Behind them, Jack could hear shouting voices and the crackle of radio communications as Robert's security team mobilized to lock down the estate. They reached the fence, and Jack threw himself at the chain link, scrabbling for purchase on the metal links. The documents made climbing awkward, but he managed to get himself over and turned to help Elena. She was lighter and more agile than he was, but fear made her movements clumsy. "Come on," Jack urged, extending his hand down to her. "They're getting closer." Elena grabbed his hand and let him pull her up and over the fence just as the first security guard rounded the corner of the house. The man was carrying a flashlight in one hand and what looked suspiciously like a gun in the other. "There," the guard shouted. "North fence, they're at the north fence." Jack and Elena hit the ground running, abandoning any pretense of stealth as they crashed through the bushes that bordered the estate. Branches tore at their clothes and scratched their faces, but they kept moving, driven by the knowledge that capture meant death. The sound of vehicles starting up behind them added a new note of urgency to their flight. Jack could hear engines roaring to life and tires squealing on asphalt as Robert's people moved to cut off their escape routes. "This way," Elena panted, veering toward a drainage ditch that ran alongside the road. "There's a storm drain that connects to the main system. If we can reach it." They stumbled down the embankment and into the concrete channel, their feet splashing through several inches of stagnant water. The storm drain Elena had mentioned was a dark mouth in the concrete wall, large enough for a person to crawl through, but small enough to be missed by casual observation. "You first," Jack said, pushing Elena toward the opening. "I'll be right behind you." Elena disappeared into the tunnel, and Jack was about to follow when headlights swept across the drainage ditch. One of the security vehicles had found their trail. "Down here," a voice shouted. "They went into the storm drain." Jack dove into the tunnel just as flashlight beams began probing the drainage ditch. The concrete passage was narrow and uncomfortable, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees through several inches of brackish water. But it was also dark and confusing, a maze of intersecting tunnels that would be difficult for their pursuers to navigate. They crawled in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, following the main tunnel as it curved away from the Blackwood estate. Elena seemed to know where she was going, leading them through several turns and intersections with the confidence of someone who'd explored these tunnels as a child. Finally, they emerged from another drainage outlet into a different part of the city, far enough from the estate that the sounds of pursuit had faded to nothing. They were soaked, exhausted, and covered in mud, but they were alive, and they had the documents. "Where are we?" Jack asked, looking around at the unfamiliar neighborhood. "About 2 miles from the estate," Elena replied, wringing water from her hair. "There's a 24-hour diner about 6 blocks from here, where we can clean up and call Maria." They made their way through the quiet residential streets, 2 bedraggled figures who looked like they'd been through a war, which Jack reflected wasn't far from the truth. They had just stolen evidence of murder from one of the most powerful families in Texas. If that wasn't an act of war, he didn't know what was. The diner Elena had mentioned was a classic American institution, fluorescent lighting, vinyl booths, and a waitress who looked like she'd seen everything and wasn't impressed by any of it. She barely glanced up when Jack and Elena walked in, apparently accustomed to serving customers who looked like they'd been dragged through a swamp. "Bathrooms in the back," she said without being asked. "Coffee's fresh and the pie's not terrible." Jack and Elena took turns cleaning up in the diner's small bathroom, washing the mud from their faces and hands, and trying to make themselves look somewhat presentable. The documents had survived their adventure largely intact, protected by the manila folders and Elena's jacket. When they were as clean as they could manage, they settled into a booth in the back corner of the diner, and Jack called Maria from the payphone near the restrooms. "Thank God." Maria's voice was tight with worry. "I was starting to think you'd been caught. Are you both okay?" "We're fine," Jack said. "Wet, muddy, and tired, but fine. And Maria, we found it. All of it. Proof of the murder, the forged documents, everything." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You're serious, so you actually found evidence that proves Robert killed Elena's father?" "I'm looking at a memo right now that discusses the best way to sabotage a small aircraft," Jack said grimly. "Written on Blackwood Industries letterhead and signed by Harrison Blackwood himself." "Jesus. Okay, listen carefully. You need to get out of there right now. Don't go back to the shop, don't go to your apartment, don't go anywhere they might expect to find you. I'm going to give you an address. Maria, what about Thomas?" "Thomas is safe. I've got him somewhere. Robert's people will never think to look. But Jack, you need to understand what you've gotten yourselves into. I've been monitoring police radio, and half the Houston PD is looking for you right now. Robert's calling it a burglary, claiming you stole irreplaceable family heirlooms and destroyed priceless artwork." Jack felt his stomach drop. "He's trying to make us look like common criminals. Worse than that. He's put a bounty on your heads. $50,000 for information leading to your capture, and he's got every private security firm in the city looking for you." Elena, who had been listening to Jack's side of the conversation, with growing alarm, grabbed the phone from his hand. "Maria, it's Elena. How much time do we have?" "Maybe a few hours if you're lucky," Maria replied. "But Elena, you need to know Robert's already been on the news. He's claiming you kidnapped Thomas and that you're mentally unstable. He's painting himself as the grieving stepfather whose beloved family has been torn apart by a disturbed woman." Elena's face went white. "He's turning public opinion against us before we can even present our evidence." "That's exactly what he's doing, and it's working. The media is eating it up, wealthy oil heiress turned desperate criminal, endangering her own child in a delusional quest for revenge." Jack took the phone back. "What do we do, Maria? We have the evidence, but if no one will listen to us, We make them listen. But first we need to get you somewhere safe. There's a legal aid office about 10 miles from your location. The address is 1247 Westheimer Road. The director there is a friend of mine, and she owes me more favors than I can count. Go there, lay low, and let me work on getting this evidence to the right people. What about Thomas? Leave Thomas to me. I'll make sure he stays safe until this is over. After they hung up, Jack and Elena sat in the diner booth staring at each other across cups of coffee that had grown cold while they tried to process the magnitude of what they were facing. We knew this wouldn't be easy, Elena said finally, but I didn't expect them to move so fast. Robert's not stupid, Jack replied. He knows that if this evidence becomes public, he's finished. He's going to use every resource he has to discredit us before we can tell our story. Elena picked up one of the documents. They'd stolen a financial record showing illegal payments to local politicians. But this is real evidence, Jack. Physical proof of crimes. How can they explain away something like this? Easy. They'll claim we forged it, or that it's taken out of context, or that we're misinterpreting standard business practices. Remember, these people have been manipulating the truth for decades. They know how to spin a story. The waitress approached their table with a coffee pot and a sympathetic expression. You folks look like you've had a rough night. Need anything else? Maybe some food to go with that coffee? Jack realized he was starving. They hadn't eaten since the Chinese takeout at his shop, and that felt like a lifetime ago. 2 breakfast specials, please, and maybe some pie if you have it. Honey, I've always got pie. What kind of trouble you two in, and don't tell me it's none of my business. I've been working this shift for 15 years, and I can smell trouble from 3 counties away. Elena and Jack exchanged glances. The waitress's question was casual friendly, but they were both acutely aware that Robert had put a price on their heads. Anyone could be a potential threat now. Just relationship problems, Elena said carefully. Sometimes you have to make hard choices about what's best for your family. The waitress nodded knowingly. Been there, sweetheart. Men can be real bastards when they don't get their way. You got somewhere safe to go. We're working on it. Well, you take care of yourselves. And if that man of yours comes around here looking for you, I never saw you. We women got to stick together. After the waitress left, Elena looked at Jack with something that might have been hope. Maybe we have more allies than we think. Maybe people will listen if we can just get our story out there. Maybe, Jack agreed. But we need to be smart about how we do it. Robert's already controlling the narrative. If we're going to change that, we need to find someone with enough credibility and influence to make people pay attention. They finished their meal in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what came next. The documents spread across the table told a story of corruption and murder that went back years, but having the evidence and being able to use it were 2 very different things. As they prepared to leave the diner, Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where her father's pendant had hung for so many years. I keep forgetting it's not there, she said softly. We had to leave it behind to close the secret room. We'll go back for it, Jack promised. When this is all over, we'll make sure you get everything that belonged to your father. It's not about the pendant, Elena said. It's about what it represented. My father's love, his protection, his belief that I was strong enough to handle whatever came my way. I've been wearing it like armor for 5 years, and now you don't need it anymore, Jack finished. Elena, you just broke into one of the most secure houses in Texas and stole evidence from under the noses of 2 killers. I'd say you've proven you're strong enough to handle anything. Elena managed a small smile at that. My father would have been proud. He would have been terrified and proud in equal measure, Jack corrected. Just like any parent watching their child fight for what's right. They left the diner and made their way toward the address Maria had given them, staying off the main roads and keeping to residential neighborhoods where a couple walking together would attract less attention. The legal aid office was in a converted house in a middle-class area, the kind of place that stayed open late to serve clients who couldn't take time off from their regular jobs. But as they approached the building, Jack noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were 2 black SUVs parked across the street, and he could see the silhouettes of men sitting inside them. "Elena," he said quietly, putting a restraining hand on her arm. "We've got company." Elena followed his gaze and saw the vehicles. How did they find us so fast? Jack thought about that. Maria had given them the address over the phone, and she'd specifically said the director was a friend who could be trusted. But phone calls could be monitored, and Robert Blackwood had the resources to track their movements if he knew where to look. They're watching the legal aid offices, Jack realized. Robert knows we'll need help getting this evidence to the authorities, so he's staking out every lawyer and legal organization in the city. So what do? We can't keep running forever. Jack looked at the documents in Elena's hands, then at the SUVs full of hired muscle waiting to capture them. An idea was forming in his mind, desperate and probably stupid, but it might be their only chance. "Elena, how well do you know the local media? Specifically investigative journalists who might be willing to take on someone like Robert Blackwood?" Elena thought for a moment. "There's a reporter at the Chronicle named Sarah Chen. She's been covering oil industry corruption for years, and she's not afraid of powerful people. But Jack, even if we could reach her, why would she believe us? We look like criminals on the run." "Because we're not just going to tell her our story," Jack said. "We're going to give her the biggest scoop of her career. Elena, what if we don't try to hide from Robert's people? What if we make them come to us in a very public place where they can't just make us disappear?" Elena stared at him. "You want to turn ourselves in? I want to turn this into a public spectacle that Robert can't control. Think about it. If we walk into the Chronicle building with this evidence surrounded by reporters and cameras, what's Robert going to do? Have us shot in front of witnesses? Claim we're dangerous criminals while we're calmly presenting evidence to journalists? It was a huge risk. If their gamble didn't work, if the media chose to believe Robert's version of events over theirs, they'd be handing themselves over to a man who'd already proven he was willing to kill to protect his secrets. But it was also their only chance to fight back on equal terms. Robert's power came from his ability to control information and shape public perception. If they could get their story out before he could silence them, they might be able to turn the tables. "There's a payphone at the gas station on the corner," Elena said, making her decision. "I'll call Sarah Chen and see if she's willing to meet with us." While Elena made the call, Jack studied the SUVs across the street. The men inside were professionals, patient alert, and undoubtedly armed. But they were also expecting Elena and Jack to behave like typical fugitives, to try to sneak around and avoid confrontation. They weren't expecting their targets to walk voluntarily into the most public building in downtown Houston. Elena returned from the payphone with mixed news. "Sarah Chen is willing to meet with us, but she wants to see some proof that our story is legitimate before she commits to anything. She's been burned before by people claiming to have evidence of corruption." "Did you tell her what we have?" "I told her we have original documents proving that Robert Blackwood murdered my father and forged legal papers to steal Carter Oil. She said if that's true, it would be the biggest story of her career. And if it's not true, then she'll probably call the police and have us arrested for wasting her time." Jack nodded. It was exactly the kind of calculated risk they needed to take. Where does she want to meet? The Chronicle building in the newsroom. She said if we're really innocent, we won't be afraid to tell our story in front of other journalists. It was perfect. The Chronicle building was one of the most public places in Houston, with security cameras, witnesses, and reporters who would notice if anything unusual happened. Robert's people might be able to fake them disappear from a dark alley, but they couldn't do it from the middle of a newsroom. "Let's go make some news," Jack said. They made their way toward downtown Houston, taking a circuitous route that kept them away from the areas where they'd spotted surveillance. The Chronicle building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel in the heart of the business district, the kind of place where important decisions were made and powerful people's secrets were exposed. As they approached the building, Jack could see more black SUVs positioned strategically around the area. Robert's people had anticipated this move and were ready to intercept them, but they were also constrained by the public nature of the location. Whatever they were planning, they'd have to be subtle about it. "There," Elena pointed to a service entrance on the side of the building. "The main lobby will be watched, but that door leads directly to the newsroom elevator." They approached the service entrance casually, trying to look like employees returning from a late dinner break. Jack's heart was pounding as they walked past one of the SUVs, close enough to see the men inside watching them through tinted windows. The service door was locked, but Elena had thought to call ahead and ask Sarah Chen to prop it open. They slipped inside and took the elevator to the 5th floor, where the Chronicle's newsroom buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major newspaper putting together the morning edition. Sarah Chen was waiting for them near the elevator, a small woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of intensity that came from years of chasing stories that powerful people didn't want told. "Elena Blackwood?" she asked, as they stepped off the elevator. "Elena Carter," Elena corrected firmly. "I stopped being a Blackwood the moment I learned what that name really meant." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Fair enough. Come on, let's find somewhere we can talk privately." She led them to a small conference room with glass walls that provided privacy, while still keeping them visible to the rest of the newsroom. It was exactly the kind of transparency they needed, protected from Robert's people but surrounded by potential witnesses. "Before we go any further," Sarah said, as they settled around the conference table, "I need to see some of this evidence you mentioned. I've been covering the oil industry for 8 years, and I know how good these companies are at creating plausible-sounding stories." Elena spread the documents across the table, starting with her father's original will and the memo detailing the plan to sabotage his aircraft. Sarah's expression grew more intense as she read her journalist's instincts, clearly recognizing the magnitude of what she was seeing. "My God," she breathed, picking up a financial record that showed illegal payments to state legislators. This is enough to bring down half the government in this state." "That's just the beginning," Jack said. "There are files full of similar documents back at the Blackwood estate. Elena's father documented everything: bribes, intimidation, illegal campaign contributions, probably dozens of other crimes." Sarah looked up from the documents with the expression of someone who'd just been handed the story of a lifetime. "Why come to me? Why not take this directly to the FBI or the district attorney?" "Because Robert Blackwood owns the district attorney," Elena said bitterly. "And probably half the FBI field office too. We need someone who can get this story out publicly, someone who can make it impossible for them to cover it up. And someone who can't be bought or intimidated," Jack added. "Maria, that's my sister, said you have a reputation for taking on powerful people." Sarah smiled grimly. "I've made a career out of pissing off oil executives. But this," she gestured to the documents spread across the table, "this is different. If I publish this story, I'm not just exposing corruption. I'm accusing one of the most powerful families in Texas of murder." "Because they are murderers," Elena said simply. Sarah, they killed my father for his company, and they're planning to kill me and my son to cover it up. How many more people are going to die before someone stops them?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying Elena's face as if trying to read the truth written there. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, I'm in. But we're going to do this right. I want independent verification of these documents, expert analysis of the handwriting. Everything we need to make this story bulletproof." "How long will that take?" Jack asked. "For a story this big, at least 48 hours, maybe more. We need to be absolutely certain of our facts before we go public." Elena's face fell. "We don't have 48 hours. Robert's people are probably surrounding this building right now. Once they figure out where we are, then we make sure they can't get to you," Sarah said firmly. "Elena, I'm going to call in every favor I'm owed in this city. We're going to put you somewhere safe while we verify this evidence, and then we're going to expose Robert Blackwood for the monster he is." As if summoned by her words, Sarah's phone rang. She answered it with a curt, "Chen," then listened for a moment before her expression darkened. "I see. How many of them? Okay, thanks for the heads up." She hung up and looked at Elena and Jack with concern. "That was building security. There are about a dozen men in expensive suits asking questions about visitors to the newsroom tonight. They're claiming to be federal agents, but they don't have proper identification." "Robert's people," Elena said. "They found us." Jack moved to the conference room window and looked down at the street. The black SUVs had multiplied, and he could see men in dark suits taking positions around the building's entrances. "We're trapped," he said simply. But Sarah Chen was already on her phone again, this time calling what sounded like the newspaper's legal department. "I need security up here right now," she was saying. "And call the police, tell them we have credible threats being made against sources in an ongoing investigation." When she hung up, she looked at Elena and Jack with the kind of determined expression that had probably terrified corrupt officials across Texas. "Nobody threatens sources in my newsroom," she said. "Elena, Jack, you're under the protection of the Houston Chronicle now, and that's a protection that even Robert Blackwood is going to think twice about challenging." Over the next hour, the newsroom transformed into something resembling a fortress. Building security took positions at all the entrances. Uniformed police officers arrived to investigate the suspicious individuals lurking around the building, and Sarah's editor mobilized the paper's considerable legal resources to ensure that Elena and Jack's rights were protected. But more importantly, word began to spread throughout the journalistic community that something big was happening at the Chronicle. Other reporters started arriving, drawn by the scent of a major story. Television news crews set up outside the building. The story that Robert had tried to control was starting to take on a life of its own. "This is good," Sarah explained as she watched the media circus growing outside. "The more attention this gets, the harder it becomes for Robert to make you disappear quietly." Elena was reading through more of the documents they'd recovered, her expression growing more grim with each page. "Sarah, there's something else you need to know. These financial records show payments to a company called Blackwater Security Services. Do you know what that is?" Sarah's face went pale. "They're mercenaries. Private military contractors who specialize in making problems disappear permanently. The payments started right after my father's death," Elena continued. "And the most recent one was dated 3 days ago." Jack felt ice forming in his stomach. 3 days ago, right around the time Elena and Thomas escaped from the house. "Robert hired professional killers to hunt us down," Elena whispered. "That's what we're really up against." The magnitude of their situation was finally becoming clear. They weren't just fighting a corrupt businessman, They were fighting someone who had access to trained killers and the resources to deploy them anywhere in the world. But they were also sitting in the middle of one of the most public newsrooms in Texas, surrounded by reporters and police officers with evidence that could bring down a criminal empire. For the first time since this nightmare began, they had a chance to fight back on equal terms. "Sarah," Elena said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I want you to publish everything. Not just the murder and the fraud, but all of it. Every bribe, every illegal payment, every life Robert Blackwood has destroyed. I want the whole world to know what kind of monster he really is." Sarah nodded, her own resolve hardening. "Then that's exactly what we're going to do. But Elena, once this story breaks, there's no going back. Your life will never be the same." Elena looked around the newsroom at the reporters working to expose corruption and hold powerful people accountable, at the police officers who were risking their careers to protect witnesses against one of the most influential men in the state. "Good," she said simply. "The life I had before wasn't worth living anyway." The next 18 hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos that would later be remembered as one of the most dramatic news cycles in Houston history. Sarah Chen had assembled a team of investigative journalists who worked through the night fact-checking documents, verifying handwriting samples, and building what would become the most comprehensive exposé of corporate corruption the city had ever seen. Elena barely slept, spending the hours answering detailed questions about her father's business practices, her marriage to Robert, and the systematic abuse she'd endured. Each revelation was more damning than the last, painting a picture of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for decades. Jack found himself serving as both protector and witness, his mechanic's practical mind helping the journalists understand the technical aspects of the sabotaged aircraft, while his street-smart instincts kept them alert to the ongoing threat from Robert's people. Because the threat was very real and growing more dangerous by the hour. Building security reported multiple attempts to infiltrate the Chronicle, from fake delivery personnel to supposed city inspectors who couldn't produce proper credentials. The black SUVs had been replaced by a more subtle surveillance presence, but everyone knew Robert's people were still out there waiting for an opportunity. "The good news," Sarah announced during a brief break around dawn, "is that we've been able to independently verify most of your evidence. The handwriting analysis confirms that the forged will documents are genuine forgeries, and our aviation expert says the sabotage described in these memos would definitely cause the kind of mechanical failure that killed your father." Elena felt a mixture of vindication and grief wash over her. After 5 years of doubting her own instincts, of wondering if she was paranoid or delusional, she finally had proof that her father had been murdered. "What's the bad news?" Jack asked, because Sarah's expression suggested there was plenty of it. "The bad news is that Robert's fighting back harder than we expected. He's called in favors from every politician he's ever bought, and they're putting pressure on our publishers to kill the story. We've also had 3 separate offers to purchase the Chronicle outright in the past 6 hours, all from shell companies that trace back to Blackwood Industries." "They're trying to buy the newspaper to stop the story?" Elena asked in disbelief. "It's been done before," Sarah said grimly. "Rich men have been silencing inconvenient journalism for as long as there's been journalism to silence. But our publisher isn't interested in selling, especially not under these circumstances." The breakthrough came at mid-morning, when Maria called with news that changed everything. "Jack, I need you to put me on speaker." Maria's voice was tight with excitement and barely controlled fury. "Elena, you need to hear this." Jack activated the speakerphone, and Maria's voice filled the conference room where they'd been working all night. "I've been digging into the Blackwater Security Services payments Elena found," Maria began. And I found something that Robert probably wishes had stayed buried. 3 years ago, Blackwater was hired to intimidate a union organizer at one of the Blackwood refineries. The organizer was a man named Miguel Santos, and he'd been trying to expose safety violations that were endangering workers. Elena felt her blood chill. What happened to him? Officially, Santos died in an industrial accident when a piece of equipment malfunctioned. But I found hospital records that show his injuries were inconsistent with the accident as described. And I found a Blackwater operative who's willing to testify that Santos was beaten to death by company security. Sarah was already taking notes, her journalist's instincts fully engaged. Is this operative reliable? Will his testimony hold up in court? His name is David Chen, no relation to you, Sarah, and he's a former Marine who went to work for Blackwater after his discharge. According to him, the Santos killing was just one of several jobs the company did for the Blackwoods over the years. He's been carrying guilt about it for 3 years, and Elena's situation was the last straw for him. Where is he now? Jack asked. Safe house under protection from some friends I have in federal law enforcement. The important thing is that he's willing to go on the record, and he has physical evidence. Photos, recordings, documents that prove Blackwater was systematically eliminating threats to the Blackwood Empire. Elena sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were uncovering. How many people did they kill? How many families destroyed because Robert wanted to protect his profits? We may never know the full extent, Sarah said quietly. But Elena, this is exactly what we need to make the story unassailable. With Chen's testimony and the documents you recovered, we have a pattern of criminal behavior going back years. The conference room door opened, and Sarah's editor, a weathered man named Bill Morrison, who'd been running the Chronicle's investigative unit for 20 years, stuck his head in. Sarah, we need to move up our timeline. I just got word that Robert Blackwood is planning a press conference this afternoon. He's going to announce that Elena has been declared mentally incompetent and that he's seeking emergency custody of Thomas for the boy's protection. Elena shot to her feet, her face white with terror. He can't do that. Thomas is my son. He can if he has the right judge in his pocket, Bill said grimly. And Elena, once he has legal custody of Thomas, that boy becomes a very powerful weapon against you. The implications hit everyone in the room simultaneously. If Robert gained custody of Thomas, he could use the boy to force Elena to recant her accusations. Or worse, if Elena continued to threaten him, Thomas might suffer the same fate as Miguel Santos and Elena's father. How long do we have? Sarah asked. His press conference is scheduled for 3 o'clock. That gives us about 4 hours to get our story published and distributed before he can spin it his way. Can we do it? Bill's smile was sharp and predatory. Sarah, we've been working all night to prepare the biggest expose in this paper's history. I've got our lawyers standing by to defend against any attempt to suppress publication, and I've already contacted our partner papers in Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio. When this story breaks, it's going to break everywhere at once. What about Thomas? Elena asked. Even if we expose Robert, he still has people who could hurt my son. Jack had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up with the calm certainty of someone who'd made a difficult decision. Maria, where exactly is Thomas right now? He's safe, Jack. I promise you that. That's not what I asked. Where is he? There was a pause, then Maria's voice came back with obvious reluctance. He's at the safe house with David Chen, the Blackwater operative. Jack, why are you asking? Because, Jack said, looking around the room at the faces of people who'd become his allies in this impossible fight. I think it's time for Thomas to tell his own story. Elena stared at him in shock. Jack, no. I won't put my son in front of cameras, won't make him a target. Elena, Jack interrupted gently. Thomas is already a target. But right now, he's also the most powerful witness we have. He's the one who remembered where the documents were hidden. He's the one who can testify to what life was like in that house. And he's the one person Robert can't discredit or intimidate. Because he's a child, Sarah said, understanding dawning in her voice. Even Robert Blackwood isn't ruthless enough to attack a 9-year-old boy in front of television cameras. Elena was shaking her head, every protective instinct screaming against the idea of exposing Thomas to the media circus that was about to erupt. But Jack could see the moment when her rational mind overcame her emotional response, when she realized that hiding Thomas might actually put him in more danger. If we do this, she said slowly, if we let Thomas speak publicly about what happened, there's no going back. He'll be in the spotlight for the rest of his life. He's already in the spotlight, Jack pointed out. The question is whether he's going to be portrayed as the victim of a deranged mother or as the brave boy who helped expose a criminal conspiracy. Bill Morrison was already on his phone making arrangements with remarkable efficiency. I can have a camera crew at your safe house in 2 hours. We'll do the interview there where Thomas feels secure, and we'll have child psychologists present to make sure everything's handled appropriately. And security? Jack asked. Federal marshals, Bill replied. I called in a favor with a friend at the Justice Department. If Robert wants to get to that boy, he'll have to go through the U.S. government to do it. 2 hours later, Jack and Elena were in the back of an unmarked federal vehicle racing through Houston traffic toward a safe house in a suburban neighborhood that looked completely ordinary from the outside. But Jack could see the subtle signs of security, unmarked cars parked strategically around the block, men in casual clothes who moved with the disciplined alertness of trained agents. Thomas was waiting for them in the living room of the safe house, and Elena's composure finally cracked when she saw her son. She pulled him into her arms and held him like she never intended to let go, tears streaming down her face. Mama, Thomas said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. Mr. Chen told me about grandfather's papers. Did we really help catch the bad men? We did, sweetheart, Elena said, pulling back to look at her son's face. But Thomas, there are some people here who want to ask you questions about what happened. Are you okay with that? Thomas looked around the room, taking in the cameras and the journalists with the thoughtful expression of someone much older than his 9 years. Will it help keep you safe, Mama? Yes, baby. It will help keep both of us safe. Then I want to do it. The interview that followed would later be called one of the most powerful pieces of television journalism in recent memory. Thomas sat between Elena and David Chen, the former Blackwater operative whose testimony had corroborated so much of their evidence, and answered questions with a clarity and honesty that cut through years of lies and manipulation. He described life in the Blackwood house with the matter-of-fact precision of a child who'd learned to observe adult behavior carefully for his own safety. He talked about hearing Uncle Robert hurt his mother, about being afraid to make noise or leave toys where they might be seen. He described the day Robert hit him and the moment when he realized that even children weren't safe from his stepfather's violence. But most importantly, he talked about his grandfather, about the man who'd taken him to see old cars and taught him about engines, who'd shown him a secret room and made him promise to remember important things. Grandfather said that sometimes good people have to keep secrets from bad people. Thomas explained to the camera, his young voice carrying absolute conviction. He said that someday, when it was really important, I might need to help Mama remember where he hid the truth. When the interviewer asked him how he felt about being part of exposing his stepfather's crimes, Thomas considered the question seriously before answering. I feel sad that Uncle Robert did bad things, he said finally. But I feel happy that now everyone will know, and he can't hurt anybody else. The interview was broadcast live on the Chronicle's website and picked up immediately by every major news network in the country. Within hours, the story of Elena Carter's fight for justice and her son's courage in helping expose a criminal empire had become national news. Robert Blackwood's press conference, scheduled for 3 o'clock, was abruptly canceled as his lawyers scrambled to deal with the avalanche of evidence that had been made public. By evening, federal agents had seized control of Blackwood Industries' headquarters and begun arresting executives based on the financial crimes documented in Elena's father's files. But the most satisfying moment came just after sunset, when Elena was finally reunited with Thomas at the safe house, and they watched the evening news together. The lead story showed Robert Blackwood being led away from his mansion in handcuffs, his face a mask of impotent rage as reporters shouted questions about murder and fraud. Harrison Blackwood had suffered what appeared to be a heart attack upon learning of his son's arrest and was under guard at a local hospital. "Is it really over, Mama?" Thomas asked, curled up against Elena's side on the safe house couch. Elena looked around the room at the people who'd become their unlikely family. Jack still wearing clothes that smelled faintly of motor oil despite everything they'd been through. Maria fierce and protective as she coordinated with federal agents. Sarah Chen already working on follow-up stories that would ensure the Blackwood Empire stayed buried. David Chen, the former soldier, whose conscience had finally overcome his fear. "The scary part is over," Elena said carefully. "But sweetheart, our lives are going to be very different now. There will be trials and court hearings, and lots of people will want to talk to us about what happened. Will we have to live in hiding?" "No," Elena said firmly. "We'll never have to hide again." 6 months later, Elena stood in the boardroom of Carter Oil wearing her father's pendant and facing a room full of executives who'd thought they'd never see her again. The legal battles had been swift and decisive, with the evidence from her father's secret room. And David Chen's testimony, the government had been able to prove that the Blackwood takeover of Carter Oil had been based on fraud and murder. Robert Blackwood had been sentenced to life in prison without parole for the murder of James Carter and Miguel Santos, among other charges. Harrison Blackwood had died of his heart attack, taking many of his secrets with him, but leaving behind enough evidence to ensure that their criminal empire would never be rebuilt. Elena had been restored to her rightful position as majority owner of Carter Oil, but she'd used that power to transform the company into something her father would have been proud of. Worker safety had become the top priority. Environmental protection had been built into every operation, and a significant portion of the company's profits now went to supporting victims of corporate violence. Jack had initially been reluctant to accept Elena's offer to become the company's head of facilities management, but she'd eventually convinced him that his practical experience and ethical compass were exactly what Carter Oil needed. Besides, she'd pointed out, who better to ensure our equipment is properly maintained than someone who's spent his life fixing things that other people broke? Thomas had adapted to their new life with the resilience that children often displayed in the face of major changes. He attended a private school where his intelligence was challenged and his emotional needs were supported. But he still spent weekends at Jack's auto shop, learning about engines and helping with repairs. Grandfather was right. He'd told Elena recently, his hands dirty from helping Jack rebuild a classic Mustang engine. If you understand how things work, you can fix them when they break. On this particular morning, as Elena prepared to chair her first annual board meeting as CEO of Carter Oil, she thought about the chain of events that had brought them to this point. It had started with a stranger's kindness on a stormy night, with Jack Miller's decision to help two frightened people rather than turn them away. That single act of compassion had set in motion a series of events that had toppled a criminal empire and restored justice to people who'd been denied it for years. It proved something Elena's father had always believed, that ordinary people, when they chose to act with courage and integrity, could accomplish extraordinary things. Maria had framed the first page of Sarah Chen's exposé and hung it in Jack's auto shop, where it served as a reminder that even the most powerful people could be held accountable for their actions. The headline read, "The Fall of an Empire, How a Mechanic, a Mother, and a Brave Boy Brought Down Texas's Most Corrupt Family." But Elena's favorite reminder of their journey was simpler and more personal. It was the sight of Thomas laughing as he worked alongside Jack in the garage, his hands dirty with honest work, his face bright with the joy of a child who no longer had to be afraid. On quiet evenings, when the three of them sat together in Elena's new home, modest by oil executive standards but filled with love and laughter, she would sometimes think about the secret room where her father had hidden the truth, waiting for the day when someone would be brave enough to find it. The room was gone now, destroyed when the Blackwood mansion was sold to developers who turned it into condominiums. But the truth her father had preserved lived on in court records and news archives, ensuring that future generations would know the real story of what had happened. And sometimes late at night, when Thomas was asleep and Jack was working late at the shop, Elena would touch her father's pendant and whisper the words that had unlocked everything. From darkness into light, from earth to sky, the treasure waits for those who know the way. The treasure hadn't been money or oil or power. It had been Justice family, and the knowledge that even in the darkest circumstances, good people could find each other and fight back against evil. As Elena looked out the window of the Carter Oil Building at the city of Houston, spread out below, she thought about all the other families who might be living in fear, all the other victims who felt powerless against wealthy predators. She picked up her phone and called Sarah Chen, who was now working on a book about corporate crime and the journalists who exposed it. "Sarah, it's Elena. I've been thinking about the Santos family, about Miguel's widow and children. What would it take to help them file a civil lawsuit against the Blackwood estate?" "I'll make some calls," Sarah replied immediately. "Elena, there are probably dozens of other families who deserved justice but never got it. Are you thinking about setting up some kind of victims fund?" "I'm thinking about a lot of things," Elena said, watching the sun set over the city where she'd once lived in fear and now stood as a symbol of hope. "But mostly, I'm thinking that my father was right. The measure of a person isn't how much money they make, it's how many people they help along the way." When she hung up the phone, Elena pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. Carter Oil had the resources to help other victims of corporate violence, to support investigative journalism, to ensure that the powerful couldn't prey on the vulnerable without consequences. She was still writing when Jack arrived with Thomas, both of them smelling of motor oil and carrying bags of takeout Chinese food. As they spread their dinner across the conference table, and Thomas told her about his day at school, Elena realized that this was what happiness felt like. Not the desperate relief of survival, but the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful with people you loved. Outside, the lights of Houston twinkled in the darkness, and somewhere in the city, another family might be facing the kind of crisis that had once seemed impossible to overcome. But now there were people watching, people who cared. People who understood that justice was not a privilege for the wealthy, but a right that belonged to everyone. And in a modest auto shop on the other side of town, a framed newspaper clipping caught the light from the street lamps, reminding anyone who cared to look that sometimes when the storms of life seemed overwhelming, salvation could come from the most unexpected places. From a stranger's kindness on a dark night. From a mechanic with grease under his fingernails and righteousness in his heart. From a woman who refused to let fear silence her voice. And from a 9-year-old boy who remembered what his grandfather had taught him about keeping important secrets until it was time to share them with the world. The story that had begun with thunder and lightning ended with something far more powerful, the quiet strength of people who chose to stand together against the darkness, proving that no empire built on cruelty and corruption could withstand the combined force of truth, courage, and love.